This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain. Chapter 51. Boyhood of the Savior. Unseemly Antics of Sober Pilgrims. Home of the Witch of Endor. Nain. Profanation. A popular Oriental picture. Biblical metaphors becoming steadily more intelligible. The Shuam miracle. The free son of the desert. Ancient Jezreel. Jehu's achievements. Samaria and its famous siege. Nazareth is wonderfully interesting because the town has an air about it of being precisely as Jesus left it, and one finds himself saying all the time, "The boy Jesus has stood in this doorway, has played in that street, has touched these stones with his hands, has rambled over these chalky hills. Whoever shall write the boyhood of Jesus ingeniously will make a book which will possess a vivid interest for young and old alike. I judge so from the greater interest we found in Nazareth than any of our speculations upon Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee gave rise to. It was not possible, standing by the Sea of Galilee, to frame more than a vague, far-away idea of the majestic personage who walked upon the crested waves as if they had been solid earth, and who touched the dead and they rose up and spoke. I read among my notes now with a new interest some sentences from an edition of 1621 of the apocryphal New Testament. Extract. Christ, kissed by a bride made dumb by sorcerers, cures her. A leprous girl cured by the water in which the infant Christ was washed, and becomes the servant of Joseph and Mary. The leprous son of a prince cured in like manner. A young man who had been bewitched and turned into a mule, miraculously cured by the infant Savior being put on his back, and is married to the girl who had been cured of leprosy, whereupon the bystanders praise God. Chapter 16. Christ miraculously widens or contracts gates, milk pails, sieves or boxes, not properly made by Joseph, he not being skillful at his carpenter's trade. The King of Jerusalem gives Joseph an order for a throne. Joseph works on it for 2 years, and makes it 2 spans too short. The king being angry with him, Jesus comforts him, commands him to pull one side of the throne while he pulls the other, and brings it to its proper dimensions. Chapter 19. Jesus, charged with throwing a boy from the roof of a house, miraculously causes the dead boy to speak and acquit him. Fetches water for his mother, breaks the pitcher, and miraculously gathers the water in his mantle and brings it home. Sent to a schoolmaster, refuses to tell his letters, and the schoolmaster going to whip him, his hand withers. Further on in this quaint volume of rejected Gospels is an epistle of St. Clement to the Corinthians, which was used in the churches and considered genuine 14 or 1500 years ago. In it this account of the fabled phoenix occurs. 1. Let us consider that wonderful type of the resurrection which is seen in the eastern countries, that is to say, in Arabia. 2. There is a certain bird called a phoenix. Of this there is never but one at a time, and that lives 500 years. And when the time of its dissolution draws near, that it must die, it makes itself a nest of frankincense and myrrh and other spices, into which, when its time is fulfilled, it enters and dies. 3. But its flesh, putrefying, breeds a certain worm, which being nourished by the juice of the dead bird brings forth feathers, and when it is grown to a perfect state, it takes up the nest in which the bones of its parent lie, and carries it from Arabia into Egypt, to a city called Heliopolis. 4. And flying in open day in the sight of all men, lays it upon the altar of the sun, and so returns from whence it came. 5. The priests then search into the records of the time, and find that it returned precisely at the end of 500 years. Business is business, and there is nothing like punctuality, especially in a phoenix. The few chapters relating to the infancy of the Savior contain many things which seem frivolous and not worth preserving. A large part of the remaining portions of the book read like good Scripture, however. There is one verse that ought not to have been rejected, because it so evidently prophetically refers to the general run of Congresses of the United States. 199. They carry themselves high, and as prudent men, and though they are fools, yet would seem to be teachers. I have set these extracts down as I found them. Everywhere among the cathedrals of France and Italy one finds traditions of personages that do not figure in the Bible, and of miracles that are not mentioned in its pages. But they are all in this apocryphal New Testament, and though they have been ruled out of our modern Bible, it is claimed that they were accepted gospel 12 or 15 centuries ago, and ranked as high in credit as any. One needs to read this book before he visits those venerable cathedrals, with their treasures of tabooed and forgotten tradition. They imposed another pirate upon us at Nazareth, another invincible Arab guard. We took our last look at the city, clinging like a whitewashed wasp's nest to the hillside, and at 8 o'clock in the morning departed. We dismounted and drove the horses down a bridle path which I think was fully as crooked as a corkscrew, which I know to be as steep as the downward sweep of a rainbow, and which I believe to be the worst piece of road in the geography, except one in the Sandwich Islands, which I remember painfully, and possibly one or two mountain trails in the Sierra Nevadas. Often in this narrow path the horse had to poise himself nicely on a rude stone step, and then drop his forefeet over the edge, and down something more than half his own height. This brought his nose near the ground, while his tail pointed up toward the sky somewhere, and gave him the appearance of preparing to stand on his head. A horse cannot look dignified in this position. We accomplished the long descent at last, and trotted across the great plain of Esdraelon. Some of us will be shot before we finish this pilgrimage. The pilgrims read Nomadic Life, and keep themselves in a constant state of quixotic heroism. They have their hands on their pistols all the time, and every now and then, when you least expect it, they snatch them out and take aim at Bedouins who are not visible, and draw their knives and make savage passes at other Bedouins who do not exist. I am in deadly peril always, for these spasms are sudden and irregular, and of course I cannot tell when to be getting out of the way. If I am accidentally murdered sometime during one of these romantic frenzies of the pilgrims, Mr. Grimes must be rigidly held to answer as an accessory before the fact. If the pilgrims would take deliberate aim and shoot at a man, it would be all right and proper, because that man would not be in any danger. But these random assaults are what I object to. I do not wish to see any more places like Esdraelon, where the ground is level and people can gallop. It puts melodramatic nonsense into the pilgrims' heads. All at once, when one is jogging along stupidly in the sun, and thinking about something ever so far away, here they come, at a stormy gallop, spurring and whooping at those ridgy old sore-backed plugs, till their heels fly higher than their heads, and as they whiz by, out comes a little potato gun of a revolver. There is a startling little pop, and a small pellet goes singing through the air. Now that I have begun this pilgrimage, I intend to go through with it, though, sooth to say, nothing but the most desperate valor has kept me to my purpose up to the present time. I do not mind Bedouins. I am not afraid of them, because neither Bedouins nor ordinary Arabs have shown any disposition to harm us, but I do feel afraid of my own comrades. Arriving at the furthest verge of the plain, we rode a little way up a hill, and found ourselves at Endor, famous for its witch. Her descendants are there yet. They were the wildest horde of half-naked savages we have found thus far. They swarmed out of mud beehives, out of hovels of the dry-goods box pattern, out of gaping caves under shelving rocks, out of crevices in the earth. In 5 minutes the dead solitude and silence of the place were no more, and a begging, screeching, shouting mob were struggling about the horses' feet and blocking the way. "Bucksheesh! Bucksheesh! Bucksheesh! Hawajee! Bucksheesh!" It was Magdala over again, only here the glare of the infidel eyes was fierce and full of hate. The population numbers 250, and more than half the citizens live in caves in the rock. Dirt, degradation, and savagery are Endor's specialty. We say no more about Magdala and Duburia now. Endor heads the list. It is worse than any Indian campoodie. The hill is barren, rocky, and forbidding. No sprig of grass is visible, and only one tree. This is a fig tree which maintains a precarious footing among the rocks at the mouth of the dismal cavern once occupied by the veritable Witch of Endor. In this cavern, tradition says, Saul, the king, sat at midnight, and stared and trembled, while the earth shook, the thunders crashed among the hills, and out of the midst of fire and smoke the spirit of the dead prophet rose up and confronted him. Saul had crept to this place in the darkness while his army slept, to learn what fate awaited him in the morrow's battle. He went away a sad man, to meet disgrace and death. A spring trickles out of the rock in the gloomy recesses of the cavern, and we were thirsty. The citizens of Endor objected to our going in there. They do not mind dirt, they do not mind rags, they do not mind vermin, they do not mind barbarous ignorance and savagery, they do not mind a reasonable degree of starvation, but they do like to be pure and holy before their God, whoever he may be, and therefore they shudder and grow almost pale at the idea of Christian lips polluting a spring whose waters must descend into their sanctified gullets. We had no wanton desire to wound even their feelings or trample upon their prejudices, but we were out of water, thus early in the day, and were burning up with thirst. It was at this time, and under these circumstances, that I framed an aphorism which has already become celebrated. I said, "Necessity knows no law." We went in and drank. We got away from the noisy wretches, finally, dropping them in squads and couples as we filed over the hills, the aged first, the infants next, the young girls further on. The strong men ran beside us a mile, and only left when they had secured the last possible piaster in the way of bakshish. In an hour we reached Nain, where Christ raised the widow's son to life. Nain is Magdala on a small scale. It has no population of any consequence. Within 100 yards of it is the original graveyard, for aught I know. The tombstones lie flat on the ground, which is Jewish fashion in Syria. I believe the Muslims do not allow them to have upright tombstones. A Moslem grave is usually roughly plastered over and whitewashed, and has at one end an upright projection which is shaped into exceedingly rude attempts at ornamentation. In the cities there is often no appearance of a grave at all. A tall, slender marble tombstone, elaborately lettered, gilded, and painted, marks the burial place, and this is surmounted by a turban, so carved and shaped as to signify the dead man's rank in life. They showed a fragment of ancient wall which they said was one side of the gate out of which the widow's dead son was being brought so many centuries ago, when Jesus met the procession. "Now when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still. And he said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he that was dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. And there came a fear on all, and they glorified God, saying, That a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God hath visited his people." A little mosque stands upon the spot, which tradition says was occupied by the widow's dwelling. 2 or 3 aged Arabs sat about its door. We entered, and the pilgrims broke specimens from the foundation walls, though they had to touch, and even step, upon the praying carpets to do it. It was almost the same as breaking pieces from the hearts of those old Arabs. To step rudely about the sacred praying mats, with booted feet, a thing not done by any Arab, was to inflict pain upon men who had not offended us in any way. Suppose a party of armed foreigners were to enter a village church in America and break ornaments from the altar railings for curiosities, and climb up and walk upon the Bible and the pulpit cushions. However, the cases are different. One is the profanation of a temple of our faith, the other only the profanation of a pagan one. We descended to the plain again, and halted a moment at a well, of Abraham's time, no doubt. It was in a desert place. It was walled 3 feet above ground with squared and heavy blocks of stone, after the manner of Bible pictures. Around it some camels stood, and others knelt. There was a group of sober little donkeys with naked dusky children clambering about them, or sitting astride their rumps, or pulling their tails. Tawny, black-eyed, barefooted maids, arrayed in rags and adorned with brazen armlets and pinchbeck earrings, were poised, water jars upon their heads, or drawing water from the well. A flock of sheep stood by, waiting for the shepherds to fill the hollowed stones with water, so that they might drink stones which, like those that walled the well, were worn smooth and deeply creased by the chafing chins of 100 generations of thirsty animals. Picturesque Arabs sat upon the ground in groups, and solemnly smoked their long-stemmed chibouks. Other Arabs were filling black hog-skins with water, skins which, well filled and distended with water till the short legs projected painfully out of the proper line, looked like the corpses of hogs bloated by drowning. Here was a grand Oriental picture which I had worshipped 1,000 times in soft, rich steel engravings. But in the engraving there was no desolation, no dirt, no rags, no fleas, no ugly features, no sore eyes, no feasting flies, no besotted ignorance in the countenances, no raw places on the donkeys' backs, no disagreeable jabbering in unknown tongues, no stench of camels, no suggestion that a couple of tons of powder placed under the party and touched off would heighten the effect, and give to the scene a genuine interest and a charm which it would always be pleasant to recall, even though a man lived 1,000 years. Oriental scenes look best in steel engravings. I cannot be imposed upon any more by that picture of the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon. I shall say to myself, "You look fine, madam, but your feet are not clean, and you smell like a camel." Presently a wild Arab in charge of a camel train recognized an old friend in Ferguson, and they ran and fell upon each other's necks and kissed each other's grimy bearded faces upon both cheeks. It explained instantly a something which had always seemed to me only a far-fetched Oriental figure of speech. I refer to the circumstances of Christ's rebuking a Pharisee, or some such character, and reminding him that from him he had received no kiss of welcome. It did not seem reasonable to me that men should kiss each other, but I am aware now that they did. There was reason in it, too. The custom was natural and proper, because people must kiss, and a man would not be likely to kiss one of the women of this country of his own free will and accord. One must travel to learn. Every day now, old scriptural phrases that never possessed any significance for me before take to themselves a meaning. We journeyed around the base of the mountain, Little Hermon, passed the old Crusaders' castle of El Foule, and arrived at Shunem. This was another Magdala, to a fraction, frescoes and all. Here, tradition says, the prophet Samuel was born, and here the Shunammite woman built a little house upon the city wall for the accommodation of the prophet Elisha. Elisha asked her what she expected in return. It was a perfectly natural question, for these people are and were in the habit of proffering favors and services, and then expecting and begging for pay. Elisha knew them well. He could not comprehend that anybody should build for him that humble little chamber for the mere sake of old friendship, and with no selfish motive whatever. It used to seem a very impolite, not to say a rude, question for Elisha to ask the woman, but it does not seem so to me now. The woman said she expected nothing. Then for her goodness and her unselfishness he rejoiced her heart with the news that she should bear a son. It was a high reward, but she would not have thanked him for a daughter. Daughters have always been unpopular here. The son was born, grew, waxed strong, died. Elisha restored him to life in Shunem. We found here a grove of lemon trees, cool, shady, hung with fruit. One is apt to overestimate beauty when it is rare, but to me this grove seemed very beautiful. It was beautiful. I do not overestimate it. I must always remember Shunem gratefully, as a place which gave to us this leafy shelter after our long, hot ride. We lunched, rested, chatted, smoked our pipes an hour, and then mounted and moved on. As we trotted across the plain of Jezreel, we met half a dozen Digger Indians, Bedouins, with very long spears in their hands, cavorting around on old crowbait horses, and spearing imaginary enemies, whooping and fluttering their rags in the wind, and carrying on in every respect like a pack of hopeless lunatics. At last, here were the wild, free sons of the desert, speeding over the plain like the wind, on their beautiful Arabian mares we had read so much about and longed so much to see. Here were the picturesque costumes. This was the gallant spectacle, tatterdemalion vagrants, cheap braggadocio, Arabian mares, spined and necked like the ichthyosaurus in the museum, and humped and cornered like a dromedary. To glance at the genuine son of the desert is to take the romance out of him forever. To behold his steed is to long in charity to strip his harness off and let him fall to pieces. Presently we came to a ruinous old town on a hill, the same being the ancient Jezreel. Ahab, king of Samaria (this was a very vast kingdom for those days, and was very nearly half as large as Rhode Island), dwelt in the city of Jezreel, which was his capital. Near him lived a man by the name of Naboth, who had a vineyard. The king asked him for it, and when he would not give it, offered to buy it. But Naboth refused to sell it. In those days it was considered a sort of crime to part with one's inheritance at any price, and even if a man did part with it, it reverted to himself or his heirs again at the next Jubilee year. So this spoiled child of a king went and lay down on the bed with his face to the wall and grieved sorely. The queen, a notorious character in those days, and whose name is a byword and a reproach even in these, came in and asked him wherefore he sorrowed, and he told her. Jezebel said she could secure the vineyard, and she went forth and forged letters to the nobles and wise men in the king's name, and ordered them to proclaim a fast, and set Naboth on high before the people, and suborned 2 witnesses to swear that he had blasphemed. They did it, and the people stoned the accused by the city wall, and he died. Then Jezebel came and told the king, and said, Behold, Naboth is no more. Rise up and seize the vineyard. So Ahab seized the vineyard and went into it to possess it. But the prophet Elijah came to him there and read his fate to him, and the fate of Jezebel, and said that in the place where dogs licked the blood of Naboth, dogs should also lick his blood, and he said likewise the dogs should eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. In the course of time the king was killed in battle, and when his chariot wheels were washed in the pool of Samaria, the dogs licked the blood. In after years, Jehu, who was king of Israel, marched down against Jezreel by order of one of the prophets, and administered one of those convincing rebukes so common among the people of those days. He killed many kings and their subjects, and as he came along he saw Jezebel, painted and finely dressed, looking out of a window, and ordered that she be thrown down to him. A servant did it, and Jehu's horse trampled her under foot. Then Jehu went in and sat down to dinner, and presently he said, Go and bury this cursed woman, for she is a king's daughter. The spirit of charity came upon him too late, however, for the prophecy had already been fulfilled. The dogs had eaten her, and they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. Ahab, the late king, had left a helpless family behind him, and Jehu killed 70 of the orphan sons. Then he killed all the relatives, and teachers, and servants, and friends of the family, and rested from his labors, until he was come near to Samaria, where he met 42 persons, and asked them who they were. They said they were brothers of the king of Judah. He killed them. When he got to Samaria, he said he would show his zeal for the Lord. So he gathered all the priests and people together that worshipped Baal, pretending that he was going to adopt that worship, and offer up a great sacrifice. And when they were all shut up where they could not defend themselves, he caused every person of them to be killed. Then Jehu, the good missionary, rested from his labors once more. We went back to the valley and rode to the fountain of Ain Jelud. They call it the Fountain of Jezreel usually. It is a pond about 100 feet square and 4 feet deep, with a stream of water trickling into it from under an overhanging ledge of rocks. It is in the midst of a great solitude. Here Gideon pitched his camp in the old times. Behind Shunem lay the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the children of the east, who were as grasshoppers for multitude. Both they and their camels were without number, as the sand by the sea side for multitude, which means that there were 135,000 men, and that they had transportation service accordingly. Gideon, with only 300 men, surprised them in the night, and stood by and looked on while they butchered each other until 120,000 lay dead on the field. We camped at Jenin before night, and got up and started again at 1 o'clock in the morning. Somewhere toward daylight we passed the locality where the best authenticated tradition locates the pit into which Joseph's brethren threw him, and about noon, after passing over a succession of mountain tops, clad with groves of fig and olive trees, with the Mediterranean in sight some 40 miles away, and going by many ancient biblical cities whose inhabitants glowered savagely upon our Christian procession, and were seemingly inclined to practice on it with stones, we came to the singularly terraced and unlovely hills that betrayed that we were out of Galilee and into Samaria at last. We climbed a high hill to visit the city of Samaria, where the woman may have hailed from who conversed with Christ at Jacob's well, and from whence, no doubt, came also the celebrated Good Samaritan. Herod the Great is said to have made a magnificent city of this place, and a great number of coarse limestone columns, 20 feet high and 2 feet through, that are almost guiltless of architectural grace of shape and ornament, are pointed out by many authors as evidence of the fact. They would not have been considered handsome in ancient Greece, however. The inhabitants of this camp are particularly vicious, and stoned 2 parties of our pilgrims a day or 2 ago, who brought about the difficulty by showing their revolvers when they did not intend to use them, a thing which is deemed bad judgment in the Far West, and ought certainly to be considered anywhere. In the new territories, when a man puts his hand on a weapon, he knows that he must use it. He must use it instantly or expect to be shot down where he stands. Those pilgrims had been reading Grimes. There was nothing for us to do in Samaria but buy handfuls of old Roman coins at $1 a dozen, and look at a dilapidated church of the Crusaders, and a vault in it which once contained the body of John the Baptist. This relic was long ago carried away to Genoa. Samaria stood a disastrous siege once, in the days of Elisha, at the hands of the king of Syria. Provisions reached such a figure that an ass head was sold for 80 pieces of silver and the 4th part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver. An incident recorded of that heavy time will give one a very good idea of the distress that prevailed within these crumbling walls. As the king was walking upon the battlements one day, a woman cried out, saying, Help, my lord, O king. And the king said, What aileth thee? And she answered, This woman said unto me, Give thy son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son, and did eat him. And I said unto her on the next day, Give thy son, that we may eat him. And she hath hid her son. The prophet Elisha declared that within 24 hours the prices of food should go down to nothing, almost, and it was so. The Syrian army broke camp and fled, for some cause or other. The famine was relieved from without, and many a shoddy speculator in dove's dung and ass's meat was ruined. We were glad to leave this hot and dusty old village and hurry on. At 2 o'clock we stopped to lunch and rest at ancient Shechem, between the historic mounts of Gerizim and Ebal, where in the old times the books of the law, the curses, and the blessings were read from the heights to the Jewish multitudes below. End of chapter 51. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 52. Curious remnant of the past. Shechem, the oldest first family on earth. The oldest manuscript extant. Genuine tomb of Joseph. Jacob's well. Shiloh. Camping with the Arabs. Jacob's ladder. More desolation. Ramah, Beroth, the tomb of Samuel, the fountain of Beera, impatience, approaching Jerusalem, the holy city in sight, noting its prominent features, domiciled within the sacred walls. The narrow canon in which Nablus or Shechem is situated is under high cultivation, and the soil is exceedingly black and fertile. It is well watered, and its affluent vegetation gains effect by contrast with the barren hills that tower on either side. One of these hills is the ancient Mount of Blessings, and the other the Mount of Curses, and wise men who seek for fulfillments of prophecy think they find here a wonder of this kind, to wit, that the Mount of Blessings is strangely fertile and its mate as strangely unproductive. We could not see that there was really much difference between them in this respect, however. Shechem is distinguished as one of the residences of the patriarch Jacob, and as the seat of those tribes that cut themselves loose from their brethren of Israel and propagated doctrines not in conformity with those of the original Jewish creed. For thousands of years this clan have dwelt in Shechem under strict taboo, and having little commerce or fellowship with their fellow men of any religion or nationality. For generations they have not numbered more than 100 or 200, but they still adhere to their ancient faith and maintain their ancient rites and ceremonies. Talk of family and old descent! Princes and nobles pride themselves upon lineages they can trace back some hundreds of years. What is this trifle to this handful of old first families of Shechem, who can name their fathers straight back without a flaw for thousands? Straight back to a period so remote that men reared in a country where the days of 200 years ago are called ancient times grow dazed and bewildered when they try to comprehend it. Here is respectability for you. Here is family. Here is high descent worth talking about. This sad, proud remnant of a once mighty community still hold themselves aloof from all the world. They still live as their fathers lived, labor as their fathers labored, think as they did, feel as they did, worship in the same place, in sight of the same landmarks, and in the same quaint patriarchal way their ancestors did more than 30 centuries ago. I found myself gazing at any straggling scion of this strange race with a riveted fascination, just as one would stare at a living mastodon or a megatherium that had moved in the gray dawn of creation and seen the wonders of that mysterious world that was before the flood. Carefully preserved among the sacred archives of this curious community is a MSS, copy of the ancient Jewish law, which is said to be the oldest document on earth. It is written on vellum, and is some 4,000 or 5,000 years old. Nothing but bucksheesh can purchase a sight. Its fame is somewhat dimmed in these latter days, because of the doubts so many authors of Palestine travels have felt themselves privileged to cast upon it. Speaking of this MSS reminds me that I procured from the high priest of this ancient Samaritan community, at great expense, a secret document of still higher antiquity and far more extraordinary interest, which I propose to publish as soon as I have finished translating it. Joshua gave his dying injunction to the children of Israel at Shechem, and buried a valuable treasure secretly under an oak tree there about the same time. The superstitious Samaritans have always been afraid to hunt for it. They believe it is guarded by fierce spirits invisible to men. About 1.5 miles from Shechem we halted at the base of Mount Ebal, before a little square area, enclosed by a high stone wall neatly whitewashed. Across one end of this enclosure is a tomb built after the manner of the Moslems. It is the tomb of Joseph. No truth is better authenticated than this. When Joseph was dying, he prophesied that exodus of the Israelites from Egypt which occurred 400 years afterwards. At the same time he exacted of his people an oath that when they journeyed to the land of Canaan, they would bear his bones with them and bury them in the ancient inheritance of his fathers. The oath was kept. And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem, in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. Few tombs on earth command the veneration of so many races and men of diverse creeds as this of Joseph. Samaritan and Jew, Muslim and Christian alike revere it and honor it with their visits. The tomb of Joseph, the dutiful son, the affectionate forgiving brother, the virtuous man, the wise prince and ruler. Egypt felt his influence, the world knows his history. In this same parcel of ground, which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor for 100 pieces of silver, Jacob celebrated well. It is cut in the solid rock, and is 9 feet square and 90 feet deep. The name of this unpretending hole in the ground, which one might pass by and take no notice of, is as familiar as household words to even the children and the peasants of many a far-off country. It is more famous than the Parthenon. It is older than the pyramids. It was by this well that Jesus sat and talked with a woman of that strange, antiquated Samaritan community I have been speaking of, and told her of the mysterious water of life. As descendants of old English nobles still cherish in the traditions of their houses how that this king or that king tarried a day with some favorite ancestor 300 years ago, no doubt the descendants of the woman of Samaria, living there in Shechem, still refer with pardonable vanity to this conversation of their ancestor, held some little time gone by, with the Messiah of the Christians. It is not likely that they undervalue a distinction such as this. Samaritan nature is human nature, and human nature remembers contact with the illustrious, always. For an offense done to the family honor, the sons of Jacob exterminated all Shechem once. We left Jacob's well and traveled till 8 in the evening, but rather slowly, for we had been in the saddle 19 hours, and the horses were cruelly tired. We got so far ahead of the tents that we had to camp in an Arab village and sleep on the ground. We could have slept in the largest of the houses, but there were some little drawbacks. It was populous with vermin, it had a dirt floor, it was in no respect cleanly, and there was a family of goats in the only bedroom, and 2 donkeys in the parlor. Outside there were no inconveniences except that the dusky, ragged, earnest-eyed villagers of both sexes and all ages grouped themselves on their haunches all around us, and discussed us and criticized us with noisy tongues till midnight. We did not mind the noise, being tired, but doubtless the reader is aware that it is almost an impossible thing to go to sleep when you know that people are looking at you. We went to bed at 10, and got up again at 2, and started once more. Thus are people persecuted by dragomen, whose sole ambition in life is to get ahead of each other. About daylight we passed Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant rested 300 years, and at whose gates good old Eli fell down and brake his neck when the messenger, riding hard from the battle, told him of the defeat of his people, the death of his sons, and, more than all, the capture of Israel's pride, her hope, her refuge, the ancient ark her forefathers brought with them out of Egypt. It is little wonder that under circumstances like these he fell down and brake his neck. But Shiloh had no charms for us. We were so cold that there was no comfort but in motion, and so drowsy we could hardly sit upon the horses. After a while we came to a shapeless mass of ruins, which still bears the name of Bethel. It was here that Jacob lay down and had that superb vision of angels flitting up and down a ladder that reached from the clouds to earth, and caught glimpses of their blessed home through the open gates of heaven. The pilgrims took what was left of the hallowed ruin, and we pressed on toward the goal of our crusade, renowned Jerusalem. The further we went, the hotter the sun got, and the more rocky and bare, repulsive and dreary the landscape became. There could not have been more fragments of stone strewn broadcast over this part of the world if every 10 square feet of the land had been occupied by a separate and distinct stone-cutter's establishment for an age. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. No landscape exists that is more tiresome to the eye than that which bounds the approaches to Jerusalem. The only difference between the roads and the surrounding country, perhaps, is that there are rather more rocks in the roads than in the surrounding country. We passed Ramah and Beroth, and on the right saw the tomb of the prophet Samuel, perched high upon a commanding eminence. Still no Jerusalem came in sight. We hurried on impatiently. We halted a moment at the ancient fountain of Beira, but its stones, worn deeply by the shins of thirsty animals that are dead and gone centuries ago, had no interest for us. We longed to see Jerusalem. We spurred up hill after hill, and usually began to stretch our necks minutes before we got to the top, but disappointment always followed. More stupid hills beyond, more unsightly landscape, no holy city. At last, away in the middle of the day, ancient bight of wall and crumbling arches began to line the way. We toiled up one more hill, and every pilgrim and every sinner swung his hat on high. Jerusalem! Perched on its eternal hills, white and domed and solid, massed together and hooped with high gray walls, the venerable city gleamed in the sun. So small! Why, it was no larger than an American village of 4,000 inhabitants, and no larger than an ordinary Syrian city of 30,000. Jerusalem numbers only 14,000 people. We dismounted and looked, without speaking a dozen sentences, across the wide intervening valley for an hour or more, and noted those prominent features of the city that pictures make familiar to all men from their school days till their death. We could recognize the Tower of Hippicus, the Mosque of Omar, the Damascus Gate, the Mount of Olives, the Valley of Jehoshaphat, the Tower of David, and the Garden of Gethsemane, and dating from these landmarks could tell very nearly the localities of many others we were not able to distinguish. I record it here as a notable but not discreditable fact that not even our pilgrims wept. I think there was no individual in the party whose brain was not teeming with thoughts and images and memories invoked by the grand history of the venerable city that lay before us, but still among them all was no voice of them that wept. There was no call for tears. Tears would have been out of place. The thoughts Jerusalem suggests are full of poetry, sublimity, and more than all, dignity. Such thoughts do not find their appropriate expression in the emotions of the nursery. Just after noon we entered these narrow, crooked streets by the ancient and the famed Damascus Gate, and now for several hours I have been trying to comprehend that I am actually in the illustrious old city where Solomon dwelt, where Abraham held converse with the Deity, and where walls still stand that witness the spectacle of the crucifixion. End of chapter 52. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 53. The Joy of the Whole Earth. Description of Jerusalem. Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Stone of Unction. The Grave of Jesus. Graves of Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. Places of the Apparition. The Finding of the Thera Crosses. The Legend. Monkish Impostors. The Pillar of Flagellation. The Place of a Relic. Godfrey's Sword. The Bonds of Christ. The Center of the Earth. Place whence the dust was taken of which Adam was made. Grave of Adam. The Martyred Soldier. The copper plate that was on the cross. The good Saint Helena. Place of the division of the garments. Saint Demas the penitent thief. The late Emperor Maximilian's contribution. Grotto wherein the crosses were found, and the nails, and the crown of thorns. Chapel of the Mocking. Tomb of Melchizedek. Graves of two renowned crusaders. The place of the crucifixion. A fast walker could go outside the walls of Jerusalem and walk entirely around the city in an hour. I do not know how else to make one understand how small it is. The appearance of the city is peculiar. It is as knobby with countless little domes as a prison door is with bolt heads. Every house has from one to half a dozen of these white plastered domes of stone, broad and low, sitting in the center of, or in a cluster upon, the flat roof. Wherefore, when one looks down from an eminence upon the compact mass of houses, so closely crowded together, in fact, that there is no appearance of streets at all, and so the city looks solid, he sees the knobbiest town in the world, except Constantinople. It looks as if it might be roofed, from center to circumference, with inverted saucers. The monotony of the view is interrupted only by the great Mosque of Omar, the Tower of Hippicus, and one or two other buildings that rise into commanding prominence. The houses are generally 2 stories high, built strongly of masonry, whitewashed or plastered outside, and have a cage of wooden lattice work projecting in front of every window. To reproduce a Jerusalem street, it would only be necessary to upend a chicken coop and hang it before each window in an alley of American houses. The streets are roughly and badly paved with stone, and are tolerably crooked, enough so to make each street appear to close together constantly and come to an end about 100 yards ahead of a pilgrim, as long as he chooses to walk in it. Projecting from the top of the lower story of many of the houses is a very narrow porch roof or shed, without supports from below, and I have several times seen carts jump across the street from one shed to the other when they were out calling. The cats could have jumped double the distance without extraordinary exertion. I mention these things to give an idea of how narrow the streets are. Since a cat can jump across them without the least inconvenience, it is hardly necessary to state that such streets are too narrow for carriages. These vehicles cannot navigate the Holy City. The population of Jerusalem is composed of Muslims, Jews, Greeks, Latins, Armenians, Syrians, Copts, Abyssinians, Greek Catholics, and a handful of Protestants. 100 of the latter sect are all that dwell now in this birthplace of Christianity. The nice shades of nationality comprised in the above list, and the languages spoken by them, are altogether too numerous to mention. It seems to me that all the races and colors and tongues of the earth must be represented among the 14,000 souls that dwell in Jerusalem. Rags, wretchedness, poverty, and dirt, those signs and symbols that indicate the presence of Moslem rule more surely than the crescent flag itself, abound. Lepers, cripples, the blind, and the idiotic assail you on every hand, and they know but one word of but one language apparently, the eternal bucksheesh. To see the numbers of maimed, malformed, and diseased humanity that throng the holy places and obstruct the gates, one might suppose that the ancient days had come again, and that the angel of the Lord was expected to descend at any moment to stir the waters of Bethesda. Jerusalem is mournful and dreary and lifeless. I would not desire to live here. One naturally goes first to the Holy Sepulchre. It is right in the city, near the western gate. It and the place of the crucifixion, and in fact every other place intimately connected with that tremendous event, are ingeniously massed together and covered by one roof, the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Entering the building through the midst of the usual assemblage of beggars, one sees on his left a few Turkish guards, for Christians of different sects will not only quarrel but fight also in this sacred place, if allowed to do it. Before you is a marble slab which covers the stone of unction, whereon the Saviour's body was laid to prepare it for burial. It was found necessary to conceal the real stone in this way in order to save it from destruction. Pilgrims were too much given to chipping off pieces of it to carry home. Near by is a circular railing which marks the spot where the Virgin stood when the Lord's body was anointed. Entering the great rotunda, we stand before the most sacred locality in Christendom, the grave of Jesus. It is in the center of the church, and immediately under the great dome. It is enclosed in a sort of little temple of yellow and white stone, of fanciful design. Within the little temple is a portion of the very stone which was rolled away from the door of the sepulchre, and on which the angel was sitting when Mary came thither at early dawn. Stooping low, we enter the vault, the sepulchre itself. It is only about 6 feet by 7, and the stone couch on which the dead Savior lay extends from end to end of the apartment, and occupies half its width. It is covered with a marble slab which has been much worn by the lips of pilgrims. This slab serves as an altar now. Over it hang some 50 gold and silver lamps, which are kept always burning, and the place is otherwise scandalized by trumpery, gewgaws, and tawdry ornamentation. All sects of Christians, except Protestants, have chapels under the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and each must keep to itself and not venture upon another's ground. It has been proven conclusively that they cannot worship together around the grave of the Savior of the world in peace. The chapel of the Syrians is not handsome. That of the Copts is the humblest of them all. It is nothing but a dismal cavern, roughly hewn in the living rock of the hill of Calvary. In one side of it 2 ancient tombs are hewn, which are claimed to be those in which Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were buried. As we moved among the great piers and pillars of another part of the church, we came upon a party of black-robed, animal-looking Italian monks, with candles in their hands, who were chanting something in Latin, and going through some kind of religious performance around a disk of white marble let into the floor. It was there that the risen Savior appeared to Mary Magdalene in the likeness of a gardener. Near by was a similar stone shaped like a star. Here the Magdalene herself stood at the same time. Monks were performing in this place also. They perform everywhere, all over the vast building, and at all hours. Their candles are always flitting about in the gloom, and making the dim old church more dismal than there is any necessity that it should be, even though it is a tomb. We were shown the place where our Lord appeared to his mother after the resurrection. Here, also, a marble slab marks the place where St. Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, found the crosses about 300 years after the crucifixion. According to the legend, this great discovery elicited extravagant demonstrations of joy, but they were of short duration. The question intruded itself, which bore the blessed Savior, and which the thieves? To be in doubt in so mighty a matter as this, to be uncertain which one to adore, was a grievous misfortune. It turned the public joy to sorrow. But when lived there a holy priest who could not set so simple a trouble as this at rest? One of these soon hit upon a plan that would be a certain test. A noble lady lay very ill in Jerusalem. The wise priests ordered that the 3 crosses be taken to her bedside one at a time. It was done. When her eyes fell upon the first one, she uttered a scream that was heard beyond the Damascus gate, and even upon the Mount of Olives, it was said, and then fell back in a deadly swoon. They recovered her, and brought the second cross. Instantly she went into fearful convulsions, and it was with the greatest difficulty that 6 strong men could hold her. They were afraid, now, to bring in the third cross. They began to fear that possibility they had fallen upon the wrong crosses, and that the true cross was not within this number at all. However, as the woman seemed likely to die with the convulsions that were tearing her, they concluded that the third could do no more than put her out of her misery with a happy dispatch. So they brought it, and behold, a miracle! The woman sprang from her bed, smiling and joyful, and perfectly restored to health. When we listen to evidence like this, we cannot but believe. We would be ashamed to doubt, and properly too. Even the very part of Jerusalem where this all occurred is there yet, so there is really no room for doubt. The priests tried to show us, through a small screen, a fragment of the genuine pillar of flagellation to which Christ was bound when they scourged him, but we could not see it, because it was dark inside the screen. However, a baton is kept there, which the pilgrim thrusts through a hole in the screen, and then he no longer doubts that the true pillar of flagellation is in there. He cannot have any excuse to doubt it, for he can feel it with a stick. He can feel it as distinctly as he could feel anything. Not far from here was a niche where they used to preserve a piece of the true cross, but it is gone now. This piece of the cross was discovered in the 16th century. The Latin priests say it was stolen away long ago by priests of another sect. That seems like a hard statement to make, but we know very well that it was stolen, because we have seen it ourselves in several of the cathedrals of Italy and France. But the relic that touched us most was the plain old sword of that stout crusader, Godfrey of Bouillon, King Godfrey of Jerusalem. No blade in Christendom wields such enchantment as this. No blade of all that rust in the ancestral halls of Europe is able to invoke such visions of romance in the brain of him who looks upon it. None that can prate of such chivalric deeds, or tell such brave tales of the warrior days of old. It stirs within a man every memory of the holy wars that has been sleeping in his brain for years, and peoples his thoughts with mail-clad images, with marching armies, with battles, and with sieges. It speaks to him of Baldwin and Tancred, the princely Saladin, the great Richard of the Lion Heart. It was with just such blades as these that these splendid heroes of romance used to segregate a man, so to speak, and leave the half of him to fall one way and the other half the other. This very sword has cloven hundreds of Saracen knights from crown to chin in those old times when Godfrey wielded it. It was enchanted, then, by a genius that was under the command of King Solomon. When danger approached its master's tent, it always struck the shield and clanged out a fierce alarm upon the startled ear of night. In times of doubt, or in fog or darkness, if it were drawn from its sheath, it would point instantly toward the foe, and thus reveal the way, and it would also attempt to start after them of its own accord. A Christian could not be so disguised that it would not know him and refuse to hurt him, nor a Muslim so disguised that it would not leap from its scabbard and take his life. These statements are all well authenticated in many legends that are among the most trustworthy legends the good old Catholic monks preserve. I can never forget old Godfrey's sword now. I tried it on a Muslim, and clove him in twain like a doughnut. The spirit of Grimes was upon me, and if I had had a graveyard I would have destroyed all the infidels in Jerusalem. I wiped the blood off the old sword and handed it back to the priest. I did not want the fresh gore to obliterate those sacred spots that crimsoned its brightness one day 600 years ago, and thus gave Godfrey warning that before the sun went down his journey of life would end. Still moving through the gloom of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we came to a small chapel hewn out of the rock, a place which has been known as the prison of our Lord for many centuries. Tradition says that here the Savior was confined just previously to the crucifixion. Under an altar by the door was a pair of stone stocks for human legs. These things are called the bonds of Christ, and the use they were once put to has given them the name they now bear. The Greek chapel is the most roomy, the richest and the showiest chapel in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Its altar, like that of all the Greek churches, is a lofty screen that extends clear across the chapel, and is gorgeous with gilding and pictures. The numerous lamps that hang before it are of gold and silver, and cost great sums. But the feature of the place is a short column that rises from the middle of the marble pavement of the chapel, and marks the exact center of the earth. The most reliable traditions tell us that this was known to be the earth's center ages ago, and that when Christ was upon earth he set all doubts upon the subject at rest forever by stating with his own lips that the tradition was correct. Remember, he said that that particular column stood upon the center of the world. If the center of the world changes, the column changes its position accordingly. This column has moved 3 different times of its own accord. This is because in great convulsions of nature at 3 different times, masses of the earth, whole ranges of mountains probably, have flown off into space, thus lessening the diameter of the earth and changing the exact locality of its center by a point or two. This is a very curious and interesting circumstance, and is a withering rebuke to those philosophers who would make us believe that it is not possible for any portion of the earth to fly off into space. To satisfy himself that this spot was really the center of the earth, a skeptic once paid well for the privilege of ascending to the dome of the church to see if the sun gave him a shadow at noon. He came down perfectly convinced. The day was very cloudy, and the sun threw no shadows at all. But the man was satisfied that if the sun had come out and made shadows, it could not have made any for him. Proofs like these are not to be set aside by the idle tongues of cavillers. To such as are not bigoted, and are willing to be convinced, they carry a conviction that nothing can ever shake. If even greater proofs than those I have mentioned are wanted, to satisfy the headstrong and the foolish that this is the genuine center of the earth, they are here. The greatest of them lies in the fact that from under this very column was taken the dust from which Adam was made. This can surely be regarded in the light of a settler. It is not likely that the original first man would have been made from an inferior quality of earth when it was entirely convenient to get first quality from the world's center. This will strike any reflecting mind forcibly. That Adam was formed of dirt procured in this very spot is amply proven by the fact that in 6,000 years no man has ever been able to prove that the dirt was not procured here whereof he was made. It is a singular circumstance that right under the roof of this same great church, and not far away from that illustrious column, Adam himself, the father of the human race, lies buried. There is no question that he is actually buried in the grave which is pointed out as his. There can be none, because it has never yet been proven that that grave is not the grave in which he is buried. The tomb of Adam. How touching it was, here in a land of strangers, far away from home and friends and all who cared for me, thus to discover the grave of a blood relation. True, a distant one, but still a relation. The unerring instinct of nature thrilled its recognition. The fountain of my filial affection was stirred to its profoundest depths, and I gave way to tumultuous emotion. I leaned upon a pillar and burst into tears. I deem it no shame to have wept over the grave of my poor dead relative. Let him who would sneer at my emotion close this volume here, for he will find little to his taste in my journeyings through Holy Land. Noble old man, he did not live to see me. He did not live to see his child. And alas, I did not live to see him. Weighed down by sorrow and disappointment, he died before I was born. 6,000 brief summers before I was born. But let us try to bear it with fortitude. Let us trust that he is better off where he is. Let us take comfort in the thought that his loss is our eternal gain. The next place the guide took us to in the Holy Church was an altar dedicated to the Roman soldier who was of the military guard that attended at the crucifixion to keep order, and who, when the veil of the temple was rent in the awful darkness that followed, when the rock of Golgotha was split asunder by an earthquake, when the artillery of heaven thundered, and in the baleful glare of the lightnings the shrouded dead flitted about the streets of Jerusalem, shook with fear, and said, "Surely this was the Son of God." Where this altar stands now, that Roman soldier stood then, in full view of the crucified Savior, in full sight and hearing of all the marvels that were transpiring far and wide about the circumference of the hill of Calvary. And in this self-same spot the priests of the temple beheaded him for those blasphemous words he had spoken. In this altar they used to keep one of the most curious relics that human eyes ever looked upon, a thing that had power to fascinate the beholder in some mysterious way and keep him gazing for hours together. It was nothing less than the copper plate Pilate put upon the Saviour's cross, and upon which he wrote, "This is the King of the Jews." I think St. Helena, the mother of Constantine, found this wonderful memento when she was here in the 3rd century. She traveled all over Palestine, and was always fortunate. Whenever the good old enthusiast found a thing mentioned in her Bible, old or new, she would go and search for that thing, and never stop until she found it. If it was Adam, she would find Adam. If it was the ark, she would find the ark. If it was Goliath or Joshua, she would find them. She found the inscription here that I was speaking of, I think. She found it in this very spot, close to where the martyred Roman soldier stood. That copper plate is in one of the churches in Rome now. Anyone can see it there. The inscription is very distinct. We passed along a few steps and saw the altar built over the very spot where the good Catholic priests say the soldiers divided the raiment of the Savior. Then we went down into a cavern, which cavilers say was once a cistern. It is a chapel now, however, the chapel of St. Helena. It is 51 feet long by 43 wide. In it is a marble chair which Helena used to sit in while she superintended her workmen when they were digging and delving for the true cross. In this place is an altar dedicated to St. Demas, the penitent thief. A new bronze statue is here, a statue of St. Helena. It reminded us of poor Maximilian, so lately shot. He presented it to this chapel when he was about to leave for his throne in Mexico. From the cistern we descended 12 steps into a large, roughly shaped grotto, carved wholly out of the living rock. Helena blasted it out when she was searching for the true cross. She had a laborious piece of work here, but it was richly rewarded. Out of this place she got the crown of thorns, the nails of the cross, the true cross itself, and the cross of the penitent thief. When she thought she had found everything, and was about to stop, she was told in a dream to continue a day longer. It was very fortunate. She did so, and found the cross of the other thief. The walls and roof of this grotto still weep bitter tears in memory of the event that transpired on Calvary, and devout pilgrims groan and sob when these sad tears fall upon them from the dripping rock. The monks call this apartment the Chapel of the Invention of the Cross, a name which is unfortunate, because it leads the ignorant to imagine that a tacit acknowledgment is thus made that the tradition that Helena found the true cross here is a fiction, an invention. It is a happiness to know, however, that intelligent people do not doubt the story in any of its particulars. Priests of any of the chapels and denominations in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre can visit this sacred grotto to weep and pray and worship the gentle Redeemer. Two different congregations are not allowed to enter at the same time, however, because they always fight. Still marching through the venerable Church of the Holy Sepulchre, among chanting priests in coarse long robes and sandals, pilgrims of all colors and many nationalities, in all sorts of strange costumes, under dusky arches and by dingy piers and columns, through a somber cathedral gloom freighted with smoke and incense, and faintly starred with scores of candles that appeared suddenly and as suddenly disappeared, or drifted mysteriously hither and thither about the distant aisles like ghostly jack-o'-lanterns, we came at last to a small chapel which is called the Chapel of the Mocking. Under the altar was a fragment of a marble column. This was the seat Christ sat on when he was reviled, and mockingly made king, crowned with a crown of thorns, and sceptered with a reed. It was here that they blindfolded him and struck him, and said in derision, "Prophesy who it is that smote thee." The tradition that this is the identical spot of the mocking is a very ancient one. The guide said that Ceolwulf was the first to mention it. I do not know Ceolwulf, but still I cannot well refuse to receive his evidence. None of us can. They showed us where the great Godfrey and his brother Baldwin, the first Christian kings of Jerusalem, once lay buried by that sacred sepulchre they had fought so long and so valiantly to wrest from the hands of the infidel. But the niches that had contained the ashes of these renowned crusaders were empty. Even the coverings of their tombs were gone, destroyed by devout members of the Greek Church, because Godfrey and Baldwin were Latin princes, and had been reared in a Christian faith whose creed differed in some unimportant respects from theirs. We passed on, and halted before the tomb of Melchizedek. You will remember Melchizedek, no doubt. He was the king who came out and levied a tribute on Abraham the time that he pursued Lot's captors to Dan, and took all their property from them. That was about 4,000 years ago, and Melchizedek died shortly afterward. However, his tomb is in a good state of preservation. When one enters the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the sepulchre itself is the first thing he desires to see, and really is almost the first thing he does see. The next thing he has a strong yearning to see is the spot where the Savior was crucified. But this they exhibit last. It is the crowning glory of the place. One is grave and thoughtful when he stands in the little tomb of the Savior. He could not well be otherwise in such a place, but he has not the slightest possible belief that ever the Lord lay there, and so the interest he feels in the spot is very, very greatly marred by that reflection. He looks at the place where Mary stood, in another part of the church, and where John stood, and Mary Magdalene, where the mob derided the Lord, where the angel sat, where the crown of thorns was found, and the true cross, where the risen Savior appeared. He looks at all these places with interest, but with the same conviction he felt in the case of the sepulchre, that there is nothing genuine about them, and that they are imaginary holy places created by the monks. But the place of the crucifixion affects him differently. He fully believes that he is looking upon the very spot where the Savior gave up his life. He remembers that Christ was very celebrated long before he came to Jerusalem. He knows that his fame was so great that crowds followed him all the time. He is aware that his entry into the city produced a stirring sensation, and that his reception was a kind of ovation. He cannot overlook the fact that when he was crucified there were very many in Jerusalem who believed that he was the true Son of God. To publicly execute such a personage was sufficient in itself to make the locality of the execution a memorable place for ages. Added to this, the storm, the darkness, the earthquake, the rending of the veil of the temple, and the untimely waking of the dead, were events calculated to fix the execution and the scene of it in the memory of even the most thoughtless witness. Fathers would tell their sons about the strange affair, and point out the spot. The sons would transmit the story to their children, and thus a period of 300 years would easily be spanned The thought is Mr. Prime's, not mine, and is full of good sense. I borrowed it from his Tent Life, M.T. At which time Helena came and built a church upon Calvary to commemorate the death and burial of the Lord and preserve the sacred place in the memories of men. Since that time there has always been a church there. It is not possible that there can be any mistake about the locality of the crucifixion. Not half a dozen persons knew where they buried the Savior, perhaps, and a burial is not a startling event anyhow. Therefore we can be pardoned for unbelief in the sepulchre, but not in the place of the crucifixion. 500 years hence there will be no vestige of Bunker Hill Monument left, but America will still know where the battle was fought and where Warren fell. The crucifixion of Christ was too notable an event in Jerusalem, and the hill of Calvary made too celebrated by it, to be forgotten in the short space of 300 years. I climbed the stairway in the church which brings one to the top of the small enclosed pinnacle of rock, and looked upon the place where the true cross once stood, with a far more absorbing interest than I had ever felt in anything earthly before. I could not believe that the 3 holes in the top of the rock were the actual ones the crosses stood in, but I felt satisfied that those crosses had stood so near the place now occupied by them that the few feet of possible difference were a matter of no consequence. When one stands where the Savior was crucified, he finds it all he can do to keep it strictly before his mind that Christ was not crucified in a Catholic church. He must remind himself every now and then that the great event transpired in the open air, and not in a gloomy candle-lighted cell in a little corner of a vast church, upstairs, a small cell all bejeweled and bespangled with flashy ornamentation, in execrable taste. Under a marble altar, like a table, is a circular hole in the marble floor, corresponding with the one just under it in which the true cross stood. The first thing everyone does is to kneel down and take a candle and examine this hole. He does this strange prospecting with an amount of gravity that can never be estimated or appreciated by a man who has not seen the operation. Then he holds his candle before a richly engraved picture of the Savior, done on a messy slab of gold, and wonderfully rayed and starred with diamonds, which hangs above the hole within the altar, and his solemnity changes to lively admiration. He rises and faces the finely wrought figures of the Savior and the malefactors, uplifted upon their crosses behind the altar, and bright with a metallic luster of many colors. He turns next to the figures close to them of the Virgin and Mary Magdalene, next to the rift in the living rock made by the earthquake at the time of the crucifixion, and an extension of which he had seen before in the wall of one of the grottos below. He looks next at the showcase with the figure of the Virgin in it, and is amazed at the princely fortune in precious gems and jewelry that hangs so thickly about the form as to hide it like a garment almost. All about the apartment the gaudy trappings of the Greek church offend the eye and keep the mind on the rack, to remember that this is the place of the crucifixion, Golgotha, the Mount of Calvary. And the last thing he looks at is that which was also the first, the place where the true cross stood. That will chain him to the spot, and compel him to look once more, and once again, after he has satisfied all curiosity and lost all interest concerning the other matters pertaining to the locality. And so I close my chapter on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred locality on earth to millions and millions of men and women and children, the noble and the humble, bound and free. In its history from the first, and in its tremendous associations, it is the most illustrious edifice in Christendom. With all its claptrap side-shows and unseemly impostures of every kind, it is still grand, reverend, venerable, for a God died there. For 1,500 years its shrines have been wet with the tears of pilgrims from the earth's remotest confines. For more than 200, the most gallant knights that ever wielded sword wasted their lives away in a struggle to seize it and hold it sacred from infidel pollution. Even in our own day a war that cost millions of treasure and rivers of blood was fought because 2 rival nations claimed the sole right to put a new dome upon it. History is full of this old Church of the Holy Sepulchre, full of blood that was shed because of the respect and the veneration in which men held the last resting place of the meek and lowly, the mild and gentle, Prince of Peace. End of chapter 51. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 54. The Sorrowful Way, the Legend of St. Veronica's Handkerchief, An Illustrious Stone, House of the Wandering Jew, The Tradition of the Wanderer, Solomon's Temple, Mosque of Omar, Moslem Traditions, Women Not Admitted, The Fate of a Gossip, Turkish Sacred Relics, Judgment Seat of David and Saul, Genuine Precious Remains of Solomon's Temple, Surfeited with Sights, The Pool of Siloam, the Garden of Gethsemane, and other sacred localities. We were standing in a narrow street by the Tower of Antonio. "On these stones that are crumbling away," the guide said, "the Savior sat and rested before taking up the cross. This is the beginning of the sorrowful way, or the way of grief." The party took note of the sacred spot and moved on. We passed under the Ecce Homo arch, and saw the very window from which Pilate's wife warned her husband to have nothing to do with the persecution of the just man. This window is in an excellent state of preservation, considering its great age. They showed us where Jesus rested the second time, and where the mob refused to give him up, and said, "Let his blood be upon our heads and upon our children's children forever." The French Catholics are building a church on this spot, and with their usual veneration of historical relics, are incorporating into the new such scraps of ancient walls as they have found there. Further on, we saw the spot where the fainting Savior fell under the weight of his cross. A great granite column of some ancient temple lay there at the time, and the heavy cross struck it such a blow that it broke in two in the middle. Such was the guide's story when he halted us before the broken column. We crossed a street, and came presently to the former residence of St. Veronica. When the Savior passed there, she came out, full of womanly compassion, and spoke pitying words to him, undaunted by the hootings and the threatenings of the mob, and wiped the perspiration from his face with her handkerchief. We had heard so much of St. Veronica, and seen her picture by so many masters, that it was like meeting an old friend unexpectedly to come upon her ancient home in Jerusalem. The strangest thing about the incident that has made her name so famous is, that when she wiped the perspiration away, the print of the Savior's face remained upon the handkerchief, a perfect portrait, and so remains unto this day. We knew this because we saw this handkerchief in a cathedral in Paris, in another in Spain, and in two others in Italy. In the Milan cathedral it cost 5 francs to see it, and at St. Peter's at Rome it is almost impossible to see it at any price. No tradition is so amply verified as this of St. Veronica and her handkerchief. At the next corner we saw a deep indention in the hard stone masonry of the corner of a house, but might have gone heedlessly by it, but that the guide said it was made by the elbow of the Savior, who stumbled here and fell. Presently we came to just such another indention in a stone wall. The guide said that the Savior fell here also, and made this depression with his elbow. There were other places where the Lord fell, and others where he rested, but one of the most serious landmarks of ancient history we found on this morning walk through the crooked lanes that lead toward Calvary was a certain stone built into a house, a stone that was so seamed and scarred that it bore a sort of grotesque resemblance to the human face. The projections that answered for cheeks were worn smooth by the passionate kisses of generations of pilgrims from distant lands. We asked why. The guide said it was because this was one of the very stones of Jerusalem that Christ mentioned when he was reproved for permitting the people to cry Hosanna when he made his memorable entry into the city upon an ass. One of the pilgrims said, "But there is no evidence that the stones did cry out. Christ said that if the people stopped from shouting Hosanna, the very stones would do it." The guide was perfectly serene. He said calmly, "This is one of the stones that would have cried out." It was of little use to try to shake this fellow's simple faith. It was easy to see that. And so we came at last to another wonder, of deep and abiding interest. The veritable house where the unhappy wretch once lived who has been celebrated in song and story for more than 1800 years as the Wandering Jew. On the memorable day of the crucifixion he stood in this old doorway with his arms akimbo, looking out upon the struggling mob that was approaching, and when the weary Saviour would have sat down and rested him a moment, pushed him rudely away and said, "Move on." The Lord said, "Move on, thou likewise," and the command has never been revoked from that day to this. All men know how that the miscreant upon whose head that just curse fell has roamed up and down the wide world for ages and ages, seeking rest and never finding it, courting death but always in vain, longing to stop in city, in wilderness, in desert solitudes, yet hearing always that relentless warning to march, march on. They say, do these hoary traditions, that when Titus sacked Jerusalem and slaughtered 1,100,000 Jews in her streets and byways, the wandering Jew was seen always in the thickest of the fight, and that when battle-axes gleamed in the air, he bowed his head beneath them. When swords flashed their deadly lightnings, he sprang in their way. He bared his breast to whizzing javelins, to hissing arrows, to any and to every weapon that promised death and forgetfulness and rest. But it was useless. He walked forth out of the carnage without a wound, and it is said that 500 years afterward he followed Mahomet when he carried destruction to the cities of Arabia, and then turned against him, hoping in this way to win the death of a traitor. His calculations were wrong again. No quarter was given to any living creature but one, and that was the only one of all the host that did not want it. He sought death 500 years later in the wars of the Crusades, and offered himself to famine and pestilence at Ascalon. He escaped again. He could not die. These repeated annoyances could have at last but one effect: they shook his confidence. Since then, the wandering Jew has carried on a kind of desultory toying with the most promising of the aids and implements of destruction, but with small hope as a general thing. He has speculated some in cholera and railroads, and has taken almost a lively interest in infernal machines and patent medicines. He is old, now, and grave, as becomes an age like his. He indulges in no light amusements, save that he goes sometimes to executions, and is fond of funerals. There is one thing he cannot avoid. Go where he will about the world, he must never fail to report in Jerusalem every 50th year. Only a year or two ago he was here for the 37th time since Jesus was crucified on Calvary. They say that many old people who are here now saw him then, and had seen him before. He looks always the same, old and withered and hollow-eyed and listless, save that there is about him something which seems to suggest that he is looking for someone, expecting someone, the friends of his youth perhaps. But the most of them are dead now. He always pokes about the old streets looking lonesome, making his mark on a wall here and there, and eyeing the oldest buildings with a sort of friendly half-interest, and he sheds a few tears at the threshold of his ancient dwelling, and bitter, bitter tears they are. Then he collects his rent and leaves again. He has been seen standing near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on many a starlight night, for he has cherished an idea for many centuries that if he could only enter there he could rest. But when he approaches, the doors slam to with a crash, the earth trembles, and all the lights in Jerusalem burn a ghastly blue. He does this every 50 years, just the same. It is hopeless, but then it is hard to break habits one has been 1,800 years accustomed to. The old tourist is far away on his wanderings now. How he must smile to see a pack of blockheads like us galloping about the world, and looking wise, and imagining we are finding out a good deal about it. He must have a consuming contempt for the ignorant, complacent asses that go scurrying about the world in these railroading days, and call it traveling. When the guide pointed out where the wandering Jew had left his familiar mark upon a wall, I was filled with astonishment. It read, S.T., 1860, X. All I have revealed about the wandering Jew can be amply proven by reference to our guide. The mighty Mosque of Omar and the paved court around it occupy a fourth part of Jerusalem. They are upon Mount Moriah, where King Solomon's temple stood. This mosque is the holiest place the Mohammedan knows outside of Mecca. Up to within a year or two past, no Christian could gain admission to it or its court for love or money. But the prohibition has been removed, and we entered freely for bakshish. I need not speak of the wonderful beauty and the exquisite grace and symmetry that have made this mosque so celebrated, because I do not see them. One cannot see such things at an instant glance. One frequently only finds out how really beautiful a really beautiful woman is after considerable acquaintance with her. And the rule applies to Niagara Falls, to majestic mountains, and to mosques, especially to mosques. The great feature of the Mosque of Omar is the prodigious rock in the center of its rotunda. It was upon this rock that Abraham came so near offering up his son Isaac. This, at least, is authentic. It is very much more to be relied on than most of the traditions, at any rate. On this rock also the angel stood and threatened Jerusalem, and David persuaded him to spare the city. Mahomet was well acquainted with this stone. From it he ascended to heaven. The stone tried to follow him, and if the angel Gabriel had not happened by the merest good luck to be there to seize it, it would have done it. Very few people have a grip like Gabriel. The prints of his monstrous fingers, 2 inches deep, are to be seen in that rock today. This rock, large as it is suspended in the air. It does not touch anything at all. The guide said so. This is very wonderful. In the place on it where Mahomet stood, he left his footprints in the solid stone. I should judge that he wore about 18s. But what I was going to say, when I spoke of the rock being suspended, was, that in the floor of the cavern, under it, they showed us a slab which they said covered a hole, which was a thing of extraordinary interest to all Mohammedans, because that hole leads down to perdition, and every soul that is transferred from thence to heaven must pass up through this orifice. Mahomet stands there and lifts them out by the hair. All Mohammedans shave their heads, but they are careful to leave a lock of hair for the Prophet to take hold of. Our guide observed that a good Mohammedan would consider himself doomed to stay with the damned forever if he were to lose his scalp lock and die before it grew again. The most of them that I have seen ought to stay with the damned, anyhow, without reference to how they were barbered. For several ages no woman has been allowed to enter the cavern where that important hole is. The reason is that one of the sex was once caught there blabbing everything she knew about what was going on above ground to the rapscallions in the infernal regions down below. She carried her gossiping to such an extreme that nothing could be kept private, nothing could be done or said on earth but everybody in perdition knew all about it before the sun went down. It was about time to suppress this woman's telegraph, and it was promptly done. Her breath subsided about the same time. The inside of the great mosque is very showy, with variegated marble walls and with windows and inscriptions of elaborate mosaic. The Turks have their sacred relics, like the Catholics. The guide showed us the veritable armor worn by the great son-in-law and successor of Mahomet, and also the buckler of Mohammed's uncle. The great iron railing which surrounds the rock was ornamented, in one place, with 1,000 rags tied to its open work. These are to remind Mahomet not to forget the worshippers who placed them there. It is considered the next best thing to tying threads around his finger by way of reminders. Just outside the mosque is a miniature temple, which marks the spot where David and Goliath used to sit and judge the people. A pilgrim informs me that it was not David and Goliath, but David and Saul. I stick to my own statement. The guide told me, and he ought to know. Everywhere about the Mosque of Omar are portions of pillars, curiously wrought altars, and fragments of elegantly carved marble, precious remains of Solomon's temple. These have been dug from all depths in the soil and rubbish of Mount Moriah, and the Moslems have always shown a disposition to preserve them with the utmost care. At that portion of the ancient wall of Solomon's temple which is called the Jews' place of wailing, and where the Hebrews assemble every Friday to kiss the venerated stones and weep over the fallen greatness of Zion, anyone can see a part of the unquestioned and undisputed temple of Solomon, the same consisting of 3 or 4 stones lying one upon the other, each of which is about twice as long as a 7-octave piano, and about as thick as such a piano is high. But, as I have remarked before, it is only a year or 2 ago that the ancient edict prohibiting Christian rubbish like ourselves to enter the Mosque of Omar and see the costly marbles that once adorned the inner temple was annulled. The designs wrought upon these fragments are all quaint and peculiar, and so the charm of novelty is added to the deep interest they naturally inspire. One meets with these venerable scraps at every turn, especially in the neighboring Mosque El Aqsa, into whose inner walls a very large number of them are carefully built for preservation. These pieces of stone, stained and dusty with age, dimly hint at a grandeur we have all been taught to regard as the princeliest ever seen on earth, and they call up pictures of a pageant that is familiar to all imaginations: camels laden with spices and treasure, beautiful slaves, presents for Solomon's harems, a long cavalcade of richly caparisoned beasts and warriors, and Sheba's queen in the van of this vision of oriental magnificence. These elegant fragments bear a richer interest than the solemn vastness of the stones the Jews kiss in the place of wailing can ever have for the heedless sinner. Down in the hollow ground, underneath the olives and the orange trees that flourish in the court of the great mosque, is a wilderness of pillars, remains of the ancient temple. They supported it. There are ponderous archways down there also, over which the destroying plow of prophecy passed harmless. It is pleasant to know we are disappointed in that we never dreamed we might see portions of the actual Temple of Solomon, and yet experience no shadow of suspicion that they were a monkish humbug and a fraud. We are surfeited with sights. Nothing has any fascination for us now but the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We have been there every day, and have not grown tired of it, but we are weary of everything else. The sights are too many. They swarm about you at every step. No single foot of ground in all Jerusalem or within its neighborhood seems to be without a stirring and important history of its own. It is a very relief to steal a walk of 100 yards without a guide along to talk unceasingly about every stone you step upon, and drag you back ages and ages to the day when it achieved celebrity. It seems hardly real when I find myself leaning for a moment on a ruined wall and looking listlessly down into the historic pool of Bethesda. I did not think such things could be so crowded together as to diminish their interest. But, in serious truth, we have been drifting about for several days, using our eyes and our ears more from a sense of duty than any higher and worthier reason, and too often we have been glad when it was time to go home and be distressed no more about illustrious localities. Our pilgrims compress too much into one day. One can gorge sights to repletion as well as sweetmeats. Since we breakfasted this morning, we have seen enough to have furnished us food for a year's reflection if we could have seen the various objects in comfort and looked upon them deliberately. We visited the pool of Hezekiah, where David saw Uriah's wife coming from the bath and fell in love with her. We went out of the city by the Jaffa Gate, and, of course, were told many things about its Tower of Hippicus. We rode across the valley of Hinnom, between two of the pools of Gihon, and by an aqueduct built by Solomon, which still conveys water to the city. We ascended the hill of Evil Counsel, where Judas received his 30 pieces of silver, and we also lingered a moment under the tree a venerable tradition says he hanged himself on. We descended to the canon again, and then the guide began to give name and history to every bank and boulder we came to. This was the field of blood. These cuttings in the rocks were shrines and temples of Moloch. Here they sacrificed children. Yonder is the Zion Gate, the Teropian Valley, the hill of Ophel. Here is the junction of the valley of Jehoshaphat. On your right is the well of Job. We turned up Jehoshaphat. The recital went on. This is the Mount of Olives. This is the hill of Offense. The nest of huts is the village of Siloam. Here, yonder, everywhere is the king's garden. Under this great tree, Zacharias, the high priest, was murdered. Yonder is Mount Moriah and the temple wall, the tomb of Absalom, the tomb of St. James, the tomb of Zacharias. Beyond are the garden of Gethsemane and the tomb of the Virgin Mary. Here is the pool of Siloam, and... We said we would dismount and quench our thirst and rest. We were burning up with the heat. We were failing under the accumulated fatigue of days and days of ceaseless marching. All were willing. The pool is a deep walled ditch through which a clear stream of water runs, that comes from under Jerusalem somewhere. and passing through the Fountain of the Virgin, or being supplied from it, reaches this place by way of a tunnel of heavy masonry. The famous pool looked exactly as it looked in Solomon's time, no doubt, and the same dusky Oriental women came down in their old Oriental way and carried off jars of the water on their heads, just as they did 3,000 years ago, and just as they will do 50,000 years hence, if any of them are still left on earth. We went away from there and stopped at the Fountain of the Virgin, but the water was not good, and there was no comfort or peace anywhere, on account of the regiment of boys and girls and beggars that persecuted us all the time for bucksheesh. The guide wanted us to give them some money, and we did it, but when he went on to say that they were starving to death, we could not but feel that we had done a great sin in throwing obstacles in the way of such a desirable consummation, and so we tried to collect it back, but it could not be done. We entered the Garden of Gethsemane, and we visited the tomb of the Virgin, both of which we had seen before. It is not meet that I should speak of them now. A more fitting time will come. I cannot speak now of the Mount of Olives, or its view of Jerusalem, the Dead Sea, and the mountains of Moab, nor of the Damascus Gate, or the tree that was planted by King Godfrey of Jerusalem. One ought to feel pleasantly when he talks of these things. I cannot say anything about the stone column that projects over Jehoshaphat from the temple wall like a cannon, except that the Moslems believe Mahomet will sit astride of it when he comes to judge the world. It is a pity he could not judge it from some roost of his own in Mecca, without trespassing on our holy ground. Close by is the Golden Gate in the temple wall, a gate that was an elegant piece of sculpture in the time of the temple, and is even so yet. From it, in ancient times, the Jewish high priest turned loose the scapegoat and let him flee to the wilderness and bear away his 12-month load of the sins of the people. If they were to turn one loose now, he would not get as far as the Garden of Gethsemane, till these miserable vagabonds here would gobble him up favorite pilgrim expression, sins and all. They wouldn't care. Mutton chops and sin is good enough living for them. The Moslems watch the Golden Gate with a jealous eye, and an anxious one, for they have an honored tradition that when it falls, Islamism will fall, and with it the Ottoman Empire. It did not grieve me any to notice that the old gate was getting a little shaky. We are at home again. We are exhausted. The sun has roasted us almost. We have full comfort in one reflection, however. Our experiences in Europe have taught us that in time this fatigue will be forgotten. The heat will be forgotten, the thirst, the tiresome volubility of the guide, the persecutions of the beggars, and then all that will be left will be pleasant memories of Jerusalem, memories we shall call up with always increasing interest as the years go by, memories which some day will become all beautiful when the last annoyance that encumbers them shall have faded out of our minds, never again to return. Schoolboy days are no happier than the days of after life, but we look back upon them regretfully because we have forgotten our punishments at school, and how we grieved when our marbles were lost and our kites destroyed, because we have forgotten all the sorrows and privations of that canonized epoch, and remember only its orchard robberies, its wooden sword pageants, and its fishing holidays. We are satisfied. We can wait. Our reward will come. To us, Jerusalem and today's experiences will be an enchanted memory a year hence, memory which money could not buy from us. End of chapter 54. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 55. Rebellion in the Camp. Charms of Nomadic Life. Dismal Rumors. En route for Jericho and the Dead Sea. Pilgrim Strategy. Bethany and the Dwelling of Lazarus. Bedouins. Ancient Jericho. Misery. The Night March. The Dead Sea. An idea of what a wilderness in Palestine is. The Holy Hermits of Mars Saba. Good Saint Saba. Women not admitted. Buried from the world for all time. Unselfish Catholic benevolence. Gazelles. The Plain of the Shepherds. Birthplace of the Savior, Bethlehem. Church of the Nativity. Its 100 holy places. the famous Milk Grotto, tradition, return to Jerusalem exhausted. We cast up the account. It footed up pretty fairly. There was nothing more at Jerusalem to be seen, except the traditional houses of Dives and Lazarus of the parable, the tombs of the kings and those of the judges, the spot where they stoned one of the disciples to death and beheaded another, the room and the table made celebrated by the Last Supper, the fig tree that Jesus withered, a number of historical places about Gethsemane and the Mount of Olives, and 15 or 20 others in different portions of the city itself. We were approaching the end. Human nature asserted itself now. Overwork and consequent exhaustion began to have their natural effect. They began to master the energies and dull the ardor of the party. Perfectly secure now against failing to accomplish any detail of the pilgrimage, they felt like drawing in advance upon the holiday soon to be placed to their credit. They grew a little lazy. They were late to breakfast and sat long at dinner. 30 or 40 pilgrims had arrived from the ship by the short routes, and much swapping of gossip had to be indulged in. And in hot afternoons they showed a strong disposition to lie on the cool divans in the hotel and smoke and talk about pleasant experiences of a month or so gone by, for even thus early do episodes of travel which were sometimes annoying, sometimes exasperating, and full as often of no consequence at all when they transpired, begin to rise above the dead level of monotonous reminiscences and become shapely landmarks in one's memory. The fog whistle smothered among a million of trifling sounds is not noticed a block away in the city, but the sailor hears it far at sea, whither none of those thousands of trifling sounds can reach. When one is in Rome, all the domes are alike, but when he has gone away 12 miles, the city fades utterly from sight and leaves St. Peter's swelling above the level plain like an anchored balloon. When one is traveling in Europe, the daily incidents seem all alike, but when he has placed them all 2 months and 2,000 miles behind him, those that were worthy of being remembered are prominent, and those that were really insignificant have vanished. This disposition to smoke and idle and talk was not well. It was plain that it must not be allowed to gain ground. A diversion must be tried, or demoralization would ensue. The Jordan, Jericho, and the Dead Sea were suggested. The remainder of Jerusalem must be left unvisited for a little while. The journey was approved at once. New life stirred in every pulse. In the saddle, abroad on the plains, sleeping in beds bounded only by the horizon, fancy was at work with these things in a moment. It was painful to note how readily these town-bred men had taken to the free life of the camp and the desert. The nomadic instinct is a human instinct. It was born with Adam and transmitted through the patriarchs, and after 30 centuries of steady effort, civilization has not educated entirely out of us yet. It has a charm which, once tasted, a man will yearn to taste again. The nomadic instinct cannot be educated out of an Indian at all. The Jordan journey being approved, our dragoman was notified. At 9 in the morning the caravan was before the hotel door, and we were at breakfast. There was a commotion about the place. Rumors of war and bloodshed were flying everywhere. The lawless Bedouins in the valley of the Jordan and the deserts down by the Dead Sea were up in arms, and were going to destroy all comers. They had had a battle with a troop of Turkish cavalry and defeated them, several men killed. They had shut up the inhabitants of a village and a Turkish garrison in an old fort near Jericho, and were besieging them. They had marched upon a camp of our excursionists by the Jordan, and the pilgrims only saved their lives by stealing away and flying to Jerusalem under whip and spur in the darkness of the night. Another of our parties had been fired on from an ambush, and then attacked in the open day. Shots were fired on both sides. Fortunately, there was no bloodshed. We spoke with the very pilgrims who had fired one of the shots, and learned from his own lips how, in this imminent deadly peril, only the cool courage of the pilgrims, their strength of numbers and imposing display of war material, had saved them from utter destruction. It was reported that the consul had requested that no more of our pilgrims should go to the Jordan while this state of things lasted, and further that he was unwilling that any more should go, at least without an unusually strong military guard. Here was trouble. But with the horses at the door and everybody aware of what they were there for, what would you have done? Acknowledged that you were afraid and backed shamefully out? Hardly. It would not be human nature, where there were so many women. You would have done as we did, said you were not afraid of 1,000,000 Bedouins, and made your will, and proposed quietly to yourself to take up an unostentatious position in the rear of the procession. I think we must all have determined upon the same line of tactics, for it did seem as if we never would get to Jericho. I had a notoriously slow horse, but somehow I could not keep him in the rear to save my neck. He was forever turning up in the lead. In such cases I trembled a little and got down to fix my saddle, but it was not of any use. The others all got down to fix their saddles, too. I never saw such a time with saddles. It was the first time any of them had got out of order in 3 weeks, and now they had all broken down at once. I tried walking, for exercise. I had not had enough in Jerusalem searching for holy places, but it was a failure. The whole mob were suffering for exercise, and it was not 15 minutes till they were all on foot, and I had the lead again. It was very discouraging. This was all after we got beyond Bethany. We stopped at the village of Bethany, an hour out from Jerusalem. They showed us the tomb of Lazarus. I had rather live in it than in any house in the town. And they showed us also a large fountain of Lazarus, and in the center of the village the ancient dwelling of Lazarus. Lazarus appears to have been a man of property. The legends of the Sunday schools do him great injustice. They give one the impression that he was poor. It is because they get him confused with that Lazarus who had no merit but his virtue, and virtue never has been as respectable as money. The House of Lazarus is a 3-story edifice of stone masonry, but the accumulated rubbish of ages has buried all of it but the upper story. We took candles and descended to the dismal cell-like chambers where Jesus sat at meat with Martha and Mary, and conversed with them about their brother. We could not but look upon these old dingy apartments with a more than common interest. We had had a glimpse from a mountain top of the Dead Sea, lying like a blue shield in the plain of the Jordan, and now we were marching down a close, flaming, rugged, desolate defile where no living creature could enjoy life, except perhaps a salamander. It was such a dreary, repulsive, horrible solitude. It was the wilderness where John preached, with camel's hair about his loins, raiment enough, but he never could have got his locusts and wild honey here. We were moping along down through this dreadful place, every man in the rear. Our guards, 2 gorgeous young Arab sheiks with cargoes of swords, guns, pistols, and daggers on board, were loafing ahead. Bedouins! Every man shrunk up and disappeared in his clothes like a mud-turtle. My first impulse was to dash forward and destroy the Bedouins. My second was to dash to the rear to see if there were any coming in that direction. I acted on the latter impulse. So did all the others. If any Bedouins had approached us then, from that point of the compass, they would have paid dearly for their rashness. We all remarked that, afterwards. There would have been scenes of riot and bloodshed there that no pen could describe. I know that, because each man told me what he would have done, individually, and such a medley of strange and unheard-of inventions of cruelty you could not conceive of. One man said he had calmly made up his mind to perish where he stood, if need be, but never yield an inch. He was going to wait, with deadly patience, till he could count the stripes upon the first Bedouin's jacket, and then count them and let him have it. Another was going to sit still till the first lance reached within an inch of his breast, and then dodge it and seize it. I forbear to tell what he was going to do to that Bedouin that owned it. It makes my blood run cold to think of it. Another was going to scalp such Bedouins as fell to his share, and take his bald-headed sons of the desert home with him alive for trophies. But the wild-eyed pilgrim rhapsodist was silent. His orbs gleamed with a deadly light, but his lips moved not. Anxiety grew, and he was questioned. If he had got a Bedouin, what would he have done with him? Shot him? He smiled a smile of grim contempt and shook his head. Would he have stabbed him? Another shake. Would he have quartered him? Flayed him? More shakes. Oh, horror, what would he have done? Eat him. Such was the awful sentence that thundered from his lips. What was grammar to a desperado like that? I was glad in my heart that I had been spared these scenes of malignant carnage. No Bedouins attacked our terrible rear, and none attacked the front. The newcomers were only a reinforcement of cadaverous Arabs, in shirts and bare legs, sent far ahead of us to brandish rusty guns and shout and brag, and carry on like lunatics, and thus scare away all bands of marauding Bedouins that might lurk about our path. What a shame it is that armed white Christians must travel under guard of vermin like this, as a protection against the prowling vagabonds of the desert, those sanguinary outlaws who are always going to do something desperate, but never do it. I may as well mention here that on our whole trip we saw no Bedouins, and had no more use for an Arab guard than we could have had for patent leather boots and white kid gloves. The Bedouins that attacked the other parties of pilgrims so fiercely were provided for the occasion by the Arab guards of those parties, and shipped from Jerusalem for temporary service as Bedouins. They met together in full view of the pilgrims after the battle, and took lunch, divided the bucksheesh extorted in the season of danger, and then accompanied the cavalcade home to the city. The nuisance of an Arab guard is one which is created by the sheiks and the Bedouins together, for mutual profit, it is said, and no doubt there is a good deal of truth in it. We visited the fountain the prophet Elisha sweetened (it is sweet yet), where he remained some time and was fed by the ravens. Ancient Jericho is not very picturesque as a ruin. When Joshua marched around it 7 times, some 3,000 years ago, and blew it down with his trumpet, he did the work so well and so completely that he hardly left enough of the city to cast a shadow. The curse pronounced against the rebuilding of it has never been removed. One king, holding the curse in light estimation, made the attempt, but was stricken sorely for his presumption. Its site will always remain unoccupied, and yet it is one of the very best locations for a town we have seen in all Palestine. At 2 in the afternoon they routed us out of bed, another piece of unwarranted cruelty, another stupid effort of our dragoman to get ahead of a rival. It was not 2 hours to the Jordan. However, we were dressed and under way before anyone thought of looking to see what time it was, and so we drowsed on through the chill night air, and dreamed of campfires, warm beds, and other comfortable things. There was no conversation. People do not talk when they are cold, and wretched, and sleepy. We nodded in the saddle at times, and woke up with a start to find that the procession had disappeared in the gloom. Then there was energy and attention to business until its dusky outlines came in sight again. Occasionally the order was passed in a low voice down the line, "Close up! Close up! Bedouins lurk here, everywhere." What an exquisite shudder it sent shivering along one's spine. We reached the famous river before 4 o'clock, and the night was so black that we could have ridden into it without seeing it. Some of us were in an unhappy frame of mind. We waited and waited for daylight, but it did not come. Finally we went away in the dark and slept an hour on the ground, in the bushes, and caught cold. It was a costly nap, on that account, but otherwise it was a paying investment because it brought unconsciousness of the dreary minutes and put us in a somewhat fitter mood for a first glimpse of the sacred river. With the first suspicion of dawn, every pilgrim took off his clothes and waded into the dark torrent, singing, "On Jordan's stormy banks I stand, and cast a wistful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land, where my possessions lie." But they did not sing long. The water was so fearfully cold that they were obliged to stop singing and scamper out again. Then they stood on the bank shivering, and so chagrined and so grieved that they merited holiest compassion, because another dream, another cherished hope, had failed. They had promised themselves all along that they would cross the Jordan where the Israelites crossed it when they entered Canaan from their long pilgrimage in the desert. They would cross where the 12 stones were placed in memory of that great event. While they did it, they would picture to themselves that vast army of pilgrims marching through the cloven waters, bearing the hallowed ark of the covenant, and shouting hosannas, and singing songs of thanksgiving and praise. Each had promised himself that he would be the first to cross. They were at the goal of their hopes at last, but the current was too swift, the water was too cold. It was then that Jack did them a service. With that engaging recklessness of consequences which is natural to youth, and so proper and so seemly as well, he went and led the way across the Jordan, and all was happiness again. Every individual waded over then, and stood upon the further bank. The water was not quite breast deep anywhere. If it had been more, we could hardly have accomplished the feat, for the strong current would have swept us down the stream, and we would have been exhausted and drowned before reaching a place where we could make a landing. The main object compassed, the drooping, miserable party sat down to wait for the sun again, for all wanted to see the water as well as feel it. But it was too cold a pastime. Some cans were filled from the Holy River, some canes cut from its banks, and then we mounted and rode reluctantly away to keep from freezing to death. So we saw the Jordan very dimly. The thickets of bushes that bordered its banks threw their shadows across its shallow, turbulent waters. Stormy, the hymn makes them, which is rather a complimentary stretch of fancy. And we could not judge of the width of the stream by the eye. We knew by our wading experience, however, that many streets in America are double as wide as the Jordan. Daylight came, soon after we got under way, and in the course of an hour or two we reached the Dead Sea. Nothing grows in the flat, burning desert around it but weeds, and the Dead Sea apple, the poets say, is beautiful to the eye, but crumbles to ashes and dust when you break it. Such as we found were not handsome, but they were bitter to the taste. They yielded no dust. It was because they were not ripe, perhaps. The desert and the barren hills gleam painfully in the sun around the Dead Sea, and there is no pleasant thing or living creature upon it or about its borders to cheer the eye. It is a scorching, arid, repulsive solitude. A silence broods over the scene that is depressing to the spirits. It makes one think of funerals and death. The Dead Sea is small, its waters are very clear, and it has a pebbly bottom and is shallow for some distance out from the shores. It yields quantities of asphaltum. Fragments of it lie all about its banks. This stuff gives the place something of an unpleasant smell. All our reading had taught us to expect that the first plunge into the Dead Sea would be attended with distressing results. Our bodies would feel as if they were suddenly pierced by millions of red-hot needles. The dreadful smarting would continue for hours. We might even look to be blistered from head to foot, and suffer miserably for many days. We were disappointed. Our 8 sprang in at the same time that another party of pilgrims did, and nobody screamed once. None of them ever did complain of anything more than a slight pricking sensation in places where their skin was abraded, and then only for a short time. My face smarted for a couple of hours, but it was partly because I got it badly sunburned while I was bathing, and stayed in so long that it became plastered over with salt. No, the water did not blister us. It did not cover us with a slimy ooze and confer upon us an atrocious fragrance. It was not very slimy, and I could not discover that we smelt really any worse than we have always smelt since we have been in Palestine. It was only a different kind of smell, but not conspicuous on that account, because we have a great deal of variety in that respect. We didn't smell, there on the Jordan, the same as we do in Jerusalem, and we don't smell in Jerusalem just as we did in Nazareth, or Tiberias, or Caesarea Philippi, or any of those other ruinous ancient towns in Galilee. No, we change all the time, and generally for the worse. We do our own washing. It was a funny bath. We could not sink. One could stretch himself at full length on his back, with his arms on his breast, and all of his body above a line drawn from the corner of his jaw, past the middle of his side, the middle of his leg, and through his ankle bone, would remain out of water. He could lift his head clear out, if he chose. No position can be retained long. You lose your balance and whirl over, first on your back and then on your face, and so on. You can lie comfortably on your back with your head down and your legs out from your knees down by steadying yourself with your hands. You can sit with your knees drawn up to your chin and your arms clasped around them, but you are bound to turn over presently, because you are top-heavy in that position. You can stand up straight in the water that is over your head, and from the middle of your breast upward you will not be wet. But you cannot remain so. The water will soon float your feet to the surface. You cannot swim on your back and make any progress of any consequence, because your feet stick way above the surface, and there is nothing to propel yourself with but your heels. If you swim on your face, you kick up the water like a stern-wheel boat. You make no headway. A horse is so top-heavy that he can neither swim nor stand up in the Dead Sea. He turns over on his side at once. Some of us bathed for more than an hour, and then came out coated with salt till we shone like icicles. We scrubbed it off with a coarse towel and rode off with a splendid brand-new smell, though it was one which was not any more disagreeable than those we have been for several weeks enjoying. It was the variegated villainy and novelty of it that charmed us. Salt crystals glitter in the sun about the shores of the lake. In places they coat the ground like a brilliant crust of ice. When I was a boy, I somehow got the impression that the River Jordan was 4,000 miles long and 35 miles wide. It is only 90 miles long, and so crooked that a man does not know which side of it he is on half the time. In going 90 miles, it does not get over more than 50 miles of ground. It is not any wider than Broadway in New York. There is the Sea of Galilee and this Dead Sea, neither of them 20 miles long or 13 wide. And yet, when I was in Sunday school, I thought they were 60,000 miles in diameter. Travel and experience mar the grandest picture and rob us of the most cherished traditions of our boyhood. Well, let them go. I have already seen the empire of King Solomon diminished to the size of the state of Pennsylvania. I suppose I can bear the reduction of the seas and the river. We looked everywhere as we passed along, but never saw grain or crystal of Lot's wife. It was a great disappointment. For many and many a year we had known her sad story, and taken that interest in her which misfortune always inspires. But she was gone. Her picturesque form no longer looms above the desert of the Dead Sea to remind the tourist of the doom that fell upon the lost cities. I cannot describe the hideous afternoon's ride from the Dead Sea to Mars Saba. It oppresses me yet to think of it. The sun so pelted us that the tears ran down our cheeks once or twice. The ghastly, treeless, grassless, breathless canyons smothered us as if we had been in an oven. The sun had positive weight to it, I think. Not a man could sit erect under it. All drooped low in the saddles. John preached in this wilderness. It must have been exhausting work. What a very heaven the messy towers and ramparts of vast Mars Saba looked to us when we caught a first glimpse of them. We stayed at this great convent all night, guests of the hospitable priests. Mars Saba, perched upon a crag, a human nest stock high up against a perpendicular mountain wall, is a world of grand masonry that rises, terrace upon terrace, away above your head, like the terraced and retreating colonnades one sees in fanciful pictures of Belshazzar's feast and the palaces of the ancient pharaohs. No other human dwelling is near. It was founded many ages ago by a holy recluse who lived at first in a cave in the rock, a cave which is enclosed in the convent walls now, and was reverently shown to us by the priests. This recluse, by his rigorous torturing of his flesh, his diet of bread and water, his utter withdrawal from all society and from the vanities of the world, and his constant prayer and saintly contemplation of a skull, inspired an emulation that brought about him many disciples. The precipice on the opposite side of the canyon is well perforated with the small holes they dug in the rock to live in. The present occupants of Mars Saba, about 70 in number, are all hermits. They wear a coarse robe, an ugly, brimless stovepipe of a hat, and go without shoes. They eat nothing whatever but bread and salt. They drink nothing but water. As long as they live, they can never go outside the walls, or look upon a woman, for no woman is permitted to enter Mars Saba upon any pretext whatsoever. Some of those men have been shut up there for 30 years. In all that jury time they have not heard the laughter of a child or the blessed voice of a woman. They have seen no human tears, no human smiles. They have known no human joys, no wholesome human sorrows. In their hearts are no memories of the past, in their brains no dreams of the future. All that is lovable, beautiful, worthy, they have put far away from them. Against all things that are pleasant to look upon, and all sounds that are music to the ear, they have barred their massive doors, and reared their relentless walls of stone forever. They have banished the tender grace of life, and left only the sapped and skinny mockery. Their lips are lips that never kiss and never sing. Their hearts are hearts that never hate and never love. Their breasts are breasts that never swell with the sentiment, "I have a country and a flag." They are dead men who walk. I set down these first thoughts because they are natural, not because they are just or because it is right to set them down. It is easy for bookmakers to say, "I thought so and so as I looked upon such and such a scene," when the truth is, they thought all those fine things afterwards. One's first thought is not likely to be strictly accurate, yet it is no crime to think it, and none to write it down, subject to modification by later experience. These hermits are dead men in several respects, but not in all; and it is not proper that, thinking ill of them at first, I should go on doing so, or, speaking ill of them, I should reiterate the words and stick to them. No, they treated us too kindly for that. There is something human about them somewhere. They knew we were foreigners and Protestants, and not likely to feel admiration or much friendliness toward them. But their large charity was above considering such things. They simply saw in us men who were hungry and thirsty and tired, and that was sufficient. They opened their doors and gave us welcome. They asked no questions, and they made no self-righteous display of their hospitality. They fished for no compliments. They moved quietly about, setting the table for us, making the beds, and bringing water to wash in, and paid no heed when we said it was wrong for them to do that, when we had men whose business it was to perform such offices. We fared most comfortably, and sat late at dinner. We walked all over the building with the hermits afterward, and then sat on the lofty battlement and smoked, while we enjoyed the cool air, the wild scenery, and the sunset. One or two chose cozy bedrooms to sleep in, but the nomadic instinct prompted the rest to sleep on the broad divan that extended around the great hall, because it seemed like sleeping out of doors, and so was more cheery and inviting. It was a royal rest we had. When we got up to breakfast in the morning, we were new men. For all this hospitality no strict charge was made. We could give something if we chose. We need give nothing if we were poor, or if we were stingy. The pauper and the miser are as free as any in the Catholic convents of Palestine. I have been educated to enmity toward everything that is Catholic, and sometimes, in consequence of this, I find it much easier to discover Catholic faults than Catholic merits. But there is one thing I feel no disposition to overlook, and no disposition to forget, and that is the honest gratitude I and all pilgrims owe to the convent fathers in Palestine. Their doors are always open, and there is always a welcome for any worthy man who comes, whether he comes in rags or clad in purple. The Catholic convents are a priceless blessing to the poor. A pilgrim without money, whether he be a Protestant or a Catholic, can travel the length and breadth of Palestine, and in the midst of her desert wastes find wholesome food and a clean bed every night in these buildings. Pilgrims in better circumstances are often stricken down by the sun and the fevers of the country, and then their saving refuge is the convent. Without these hospitable retreats, travel in Palestine would be a pleasure which none but the strongest men could dare to undertake. Our party, pilgrims and all, will always be ready and always willing to touch glasses and drink health, prosperity, and long life to the convent fathers of Palestine. So, rested and refreshed, we fell into line and filed away over the barren mountains of Judea, and along rocky ridges and through sterile gorges, where eternal silence and solitude reigned. Even the scattering groups of armed shepherds we met the afternoon before, tending their flocks of long-haired goats, were wanting here. We saw but two living creatures. They were gazelles of soft-eyed notoriety. They looked like very young kids, but they annihilated distance like an express train. I have not seen animals that moved faster, unless I might say it of the antelope of our own great plains. At 9 or 10 in the morning we reached the Plain of the Shepherds, and stood in a walled garden of olives, where the shepherds were watching their flocks by night, 18 centuries ago, when the multitude of angels brought them the tidings that the Savior was born. A quarter of a mile away was Bethlehem of Judea, and the pilgrims took some of the stone wall and hurried on. The Plain of the Shepherds is a desert, paved with loose stones, void of vegetation, glaring in the fierce sun. Only the music of the angels it knew once could charm its shrubs and flowers to life again and restore its vanished beauty. No less potent enchantment could avail to work this miracle. In the huge Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, built 1,500 years ago by the inveterate St. Helena, they took us below ground and into a grotto cut in the living rock. This was the manger where Christ was born. A silver star set in the floor bears a Latin inscription to that effect. It is polished with the kisses of many generations of worshipping pilgrims. The grotto was tricked out in the usual tasteless style observable in all the holy places of Palestine. As in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, envy and uncharitableness were apparent here. The priests and the members of the Greek and Latin churches cannot come by the same corridor to kneel in the sacred birthplace of the Redeemer, but are compelled to approach and retire by different avenues, lest they quarrel and fight on this holiest ground on earth. I have no meditations suggested by this spot where the very first Merry Christmas was uttered in all the world, and from whence the friend of my childhood, Santa Claus, departed on his first journey, to gladden and continue to gladden roaring firesides on wintry mornings in many a distant land forever and forever. I touch with reverent finger the actual spot where the infant Jesus lay, but I think nothing. You cannot think in this place any more than you can in any other in Palestine that would be likely to inspire reflection. Beggars, cripples, and monks compass you about, and make you think only of bucksheesh when you would rather think of something more in keeping with the character of the spot. I was glad to get away, and glad when we had walked through the grottos where Eusebius wrote, and Jerome fasted, and Joseph prepared for the flight into Egypt, and the dozen other distinguished grottos, and knew we were done. The Church of the Nativity is almost as well packed with exceedingly holy places as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself. They even have in it a grotto wherein 20,000 children were slaughtered by Herod when he was seeking the life of the infant Savior. We went to the Milk Grotto, of course, a cavern where Mary hid herself for a while before the flight into Egypt. Its walls were black before she entered, but in suckling the child a drop of her milk fell upon the floor and instantly changed the darkness of the walls to its own snowy hue. We took many little fragments of stone from here, because it is well known in all the East that a barren woman hath need only to touch her lips to one of these, and her failing will depart from her. We took many specimens, to the end that we might confer happiness upon certain households that we wot of. We got away from Bethlehem and its troops of beggars and relic peddlers in the afternoon, and after spending some little time at Rachel's tomb, hurried to Jerusalem as fast as possible. I never was so glad to get home again before. I never have enjoyed rest as I have enjoyed it during these last few hours. The journey to the Dead Sea, the Jordan, and Bethlehem was short, but it was an exhausting one. Such roasting heat, such oppressive solitude, and such dismal desolation cannot surely exist elsewhere on earth. And such fatigue! The commonest sagacity warns me that I ought to tell the customary pleasant lie, and say I tore myself reluctantly away from every noted place in Palestine. Everybody tells that, but with as little ostentation as I may, I doubt the word of every he who tells it. I could take a dreadful oath that I have never heard any one of our 40 pilgrims say anything of the sort, and they are as worthy and as sincerely devout as any that come here. They will say it when they get home fast enough, but why should they not? They do not wish to array themselves against all the Lamartines and Grimeses in the world. It does not stand to reason that men are reluctant to leave places where the very life is almost badgered out of them by importunate swarms of beggars and peddlers who hang in strings to one's sleeves and coat-tails, and shriek and shout in his ears, and horrify his vision with the ghastly sores and malformations they exhibit. One is glad to get away. I have heard shameless people say they were glad to get away from ladies' festivals, where they were importuned to buy by bevies of lovely young ladies, transform those houris into dusky hags and ragged savages, and replace their rounded forms with shrunken and knotted distortions, their soft hands with scarred and hideous deformities, and the persuasive music of their voices with the discordant din of a hated language, and then see how much lingering reluctance to leave could be mustered. No, it is the neat thing to say you were reluctant, and then append the profound thoughts that struggled for utterance in your brain, but it is the true thing to say you were not reluctant, and found it impossible to think at all, though in good sooth it is not respectable to say it, and not poetical either. We do not think in the holy places, we think in bed, afterwards, when the glare, and the noise, and the confusion are gone, and in fancy we revisit alone the solemn monuments of the past, and summon the phantom pageants of an age that has passed away. End of chapter 55. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 56. Departure from Jerusalem. Samson. The Plain of Sharon. Arrival at Joppa. Horse of Simon the Tanner. The long pilgrimage ended. Character of Palestine scenery. The curse. We visited all the holy places about Jerusalem which we had left unvisited when we journeyed to the Jordan, and then, about 3 o'clock one afternoon, we fell into procession and marched out at the stately Damascus gate, and the walls of Jerusalem shut us out forever. We paused on the summit of a distant hill, and took a final look, and made a final farewell to the venerable city which had been such a good home to us. For about 4 hours we traveled downhill constantly. We followed a narrow bridle path which traversed the beds of the mountain gorges, and when we could, we got out of the way of the long trains of laden camels and asses, and when we could not, we suffered the misery of being mashed up against perpendicular walls of rock, and having our legs bruised by the passing freight. Jack was caught 2 or 3 times, and Dan and Moult as often. One horse had a heavy fall on the slippery rocks, and the others had narrow escapes. However, this was as good a road as we had found in Palestine, and possibly even the best, and so there was not much grumbling. Sometimes, in the glens, we came upon luxuriant orchards of figs, apricots, pomegranates, and such things, but oftener the scenery was rugged, mountainous, verdureless, and forbidding. Here and there towers were perched high up on acclivities which seemed almost inaccessible. This fashion is as old as Palestine itself, and was adopted in ancient times for security against enemies. We crossed the brook which furnished David the stone that killed Goliath, and no doubt we looked upon the very ground whereon that noted battle was fought. We passed by a picturesque old Gothic ruin, whose stone pavements had rung to the armed heels of many a valorous crusader, and we rode through a piece of country which we were told once knew Samson as a citizen. We stayed all night with the good monks at the convent of Ramleh, and in the morning got up and galloped the horses a good part of the distance from there to Jaffa, or Joppa, for the plain was as level as a floor, and free from stones, and besides this was our last march in Holy Land. These 2 or 3 hours finished, we and the tired horses could have rest and sleep as long as we wanted it. This was the plain of which Joshua spoke when he said, "Sun, stand thou still on Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon." As we drew near to Jaffa, the boys spurred up the horses and indulged in the excitement of an actual race, an experience we had hardly had since we raced on donkeys in the Azores Islands. We came finally to the noble grove of orange trees in which the oriental city of Jaffa lies buried. We passed through the walls, and rode again down narrow streets and among swarms of animated rags, and saw other sights and had other experiences we had long been familiar with. We dismounted, for the last time, and out in the offing, riding at anchor, we saw the ship. I put an exclamation point there, because we felt one when we saw the vessel. The long pilgrimage was ended, and somehow we seemed to feel glad of it. For description of Jaffa, see Universal Gazetteer. Simon the Tanner formerly lived here. We went to his house. All the pilgrims visit Simon the Tanner's house. Peter saw the vision of the beasts let down in a sheet when he lay upon the roof of Simon the tanner's house. It was from Jaffa that Jonah sailed when he was told to go and prophesy against Nineveh, and no doubt it was not far from the town that the whale threw him up when he discovered that he had no ticket. Jonah was disobedient, and of a fault-finding, complaining disposition, and deserves to be lightly spoken of, almost. The timbers used in the construction of Solomon's temple were floated to Jaffa in rafts, and the narrow opening in the reef through which they passed to the shore is not an inch wider or a shade less dangerous to navigate than it was then. Such is the sleepy nature of the population Palestine's only good seaport has now and always had. Jaffa has a history, and a stirring one. It will not be discovered anywhere in this book. If the reader will call at the circulating library and mention my name, he will be furnished with books which will afford him the fullest information concerning Jaffa. So ends the pilgrimage. We ought to be glad that we did not make it for the purpose of feasting our eyes upon fascinating aspects of nature, for we should have been disappointed, at least at this season of the year. A writer in Life in the Holy Land observes, "Monotonous and uninviting as much of the Holy Land will appear to persons accustomed to the almost constant verdure of flowers, ample streams, and varied surface of our own country, we must remember that its aspect to the Israelites after the weary march of 40 years through the desert must have been very different." Which all of us will freely grant. But it truly is monotonous and uninviting, and there is no sufficient reason for describing it as being otherwise. Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. The hills are barren, they are dull of color, they are unpicturesque in shape. The valleys are unsightly deserts fringed with a feeble vegetation that has an expression about it of being sorrowful and despondent. The Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee sleep in the midst of a vast stretch of hill and plain wherein the eye rests upon no pleasant tint, no striking object, no soft picture dreaming in a purple haze or mottled with the shadows of the clouds. Every outline is harsh, every feature is distinct, there is no perspective, distance works no enchantment here. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. Small shreds and patches of it must be very beautiful in the full flush of spring, however, and all the more beautiful by contrast with the far-reaching desolation that surrounds them on every side. I would like much to see the fringes of the Jordan in springtime, and Shechem, Esdraelon, Ajalon, and the border of Galilee, but even then these spots would seem mere toy gardens set at wide intervals in the waste of a limitless desolation. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Over it broods the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. Where Sodom and Gomorrah reared their domes and towers, that solemn sea now floods the plain, in whose bitter waters no living thing exists, over whose waveless surface the blistering air hangs motionless and dead, about whose borders nothing grows but weeds and scattering tufts of cane, and that treacherous fruit that promises refreshment to parching lips, but turns to ashes at the touch. Nazareth is forlorn. About that ford of Jordan where the hosts of Israel entered the promised land with songs of rejoicing, one finds only a squalid camp of fantastic Bedouins of the desert. Jericho the accursed lies a moldering ruin today, even as Joshua's miracle left it more than 3,000 years ago. Bethlehem and Bethany, in their poverty and their humiliation, have nothing about them now to remind one that they once knew the high honor of the Saviour's presence. The hallowed spot where the shepherds watched their flocks by night, and where the angels sang peace on earth, good will to men, is untenanted by any living creature, and unblessed by any feature that is pleasant to the eye. Renowned Jerusalem itself, the stateliest name in history, has lost all its ancient grandeur, and is become a pauper village. The riches of Solomon are no longer there to compel the admiration of visiting Oriental queens. The wonderful temple which was the pride and the glory of Israel is gone, and the Ottoman crescent is lifted above the spot where, on that most memorable day in the annals of the world, they reared the Holy Cross. The noted Sea of Galilee, where Roman fleets once rode at anchor and the disciples of the Savior sailed in their ships, was long ago deserted by the devotees of war and commerce, and its borders are a silent wilderness. Capernaum is a shapeless ruin. Magdala is the home of beggared Arabs. Bethsaida and Chorazin have vanished from the earth, and the desert places round about them, where thousands of men once listened to the Saviour's voice and ate the miraculous bread, sleep in the hush of a solitude that is inhabited only by birds of prey and skulking foxes. Palestine is desolate and unlovely, and why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the Deity beautify a land? Palestine is no more of this workday world. It is sacred to poetry and tradition. It is dreamland. End of chapter 56. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain. Chapter 57. The happiness of being at sea once more. Home as it is in a pleasure ship. Shaking hands with the vessel. Jack in costume. His father's parting advice. Approaching Egypt. Ashore in Alexandria. A deserved compliment for the donkeys. Invasion of the lost tribes of America. End of the celebrated Jaffa colony. Scenes in Grand Cairo. Shepherd's Hotel, contrasted with a certain American hotel. Preparing for the pyramids. It was worth a kingdom to be at sea again. It was a relief to drop all anxiety whatsoever, all questions as to where we should go, how long we should stay, whether it were worth while to go or not, all anxieties about the condition of the horses, all such questions as, shall we ever get to water? Shall we ever lunch? Ferguson, how many more million miles have we got to creep under this awful sun before we camp? It was a relief to cast all these torturing little anxieties far away. Ropes of steel they were, and every one with a separate and distinct strain on it, and feel the temporary contentment that is born of the banishment of all care and responsibility. We did not look at the compass. We did not care, now, where the ship went to, so that she went out of sight of land as quickly as possible. When I travel again, I wish to go in a pleasure ship. No amount of money could have purchased for us, in a strange vessel and among unfamiliar faces, the perfect satisfaction and the sense of being at home again which we experienced when we stepped on board the Quaker City, our own ship, after this wearisome pilgrimage. It is a something we have felt always when we returned to her, and a something we had no desire to sell. We took off our blue woolen shirts, our spurs and heavy boots, our sanguinary revolvers, and our buckskin-seated pantaloons, and got shaved, and came out in Christian costume once more. All but Jack, who changed all other articles of his dress, but clung to his traveling pantaloons. They still preserved their ample buckskin seat intact, and so his short pea-jacket and his long, thin legs assisted to make him a picturesque object whenever he stood on the forecastle looking abroad upon the ocean over the bows. At such times his father's last injunction suggested itself to me. He said, "Jack, my boy, you are about to go among a brilliant company of gentlemen and ladies who are refined and cultivated, and thoroughly accomplished in the manners and customs of good society. Listen to their conversation, study their habits of life, and learn. Be polite and obliging to all, and considerate towards everyone's opinions, failings, and prejudices. Command the just respect of all your fellow voyagers, even though you fail to win their friendly regard. And Jack, don't you ever dare, while you live, appear in public on those decks in fair weather in a costume unbecoming your mother's drawing-room." It would have been worth any price if the father of this hopeful youth could have stepped on board some time and seen him standing high on the forecastle, pea-jacket, tasseled red fez, buckskin patch and all, placidly contemplating the ocean, a rare spectacle for anybody's drawing-room. After a pleasant voyage and a good rest, we drew near to Egypt, and out of the mellowest of sunsets we saw the domes and minarets of Alexandria rise into view. As soon as the anchor was down, Jack and I got a boat and went ashore. It was night by this time, and the other passengers were content to remain at home and visit ancient Egypt after breakfast. It was the way they did it at Constantinople. They took a lively interest in new countries, but their schoolboy impatience had worn off, and they had learned that it was wisdom to take things easy and go along comfortably. These old countries do not go away in the night, they stay till after breakfast. When we reached the pier, we found an army of Egyptian boys with donkeys no larger than themselves, waiting for passengers. For donkeys are the omnibuses of Egypt. We preferred to walk, but we could not have our own way. The boys crowded about us, clamored around us, and slewed their donkeys exactly across our path, no matter which way we turned. They were good-natured rascals, and so were the donkeys. We mounted, and the boys ran behind us and kept the donkeys in a furious gallop, as is the fashion at Damascus. I believe I would rather ride a donkey than any beast in the world. He goes briskly, he puts on no airs, he is docile, though opinionated. Satan himself could not scare him, and he is convenient, very convenient. When you are tired riding, you can rest your feet on the ground and let him gallop from under you. We found the hotel and secured rooms, and were happy to know that the Prince of Wales had stopped there once. They had it everywhere on signs. No other princes had stopped there since, till Jack and I came. We went abroad through the town then, and found it a city of huge commercial buildings, and broad, handsome streets brilliant with gaslight. By night it was a sort of reminiscence of Paris. But finally Jack found an ice-cream saloon, and that closed investigations for that evening. The weather was very hot. It had been many a day since Jack had seen ice cream, and so it was useless to talk of leaving the saloon till it shut up. In the morning the lost tribes of America came ashore and infested the hotels, and took possession of all the donkeys and other open barouches that offered. They went in picturesque procession to the American consuls, to the great gardens, to Cleopatra's Needles, to Pompey's Pillar, to the palace of the Viceroy of Egypt, to the Nile, to the superb groves of date palms. One of our most inveterate relic hunters had his hammer with him, and tried to break a fragment off the upright needle, and could not do it. He tried the prostrate one, and failed. He borrowed a heavy sledge-hammer from a mason, and tried again. He tried Pompey's Pillar, and this baffled him. Scattered all about the mighty monolith were sphinxes of noble countenance, carved out of Egyptian granite as hard as blue steel, and whose shapely features the wear of 5,000 years had failed to mark or mar. The relic hunter battered at these persistently, and sweated profusely over his work. He might as well have attempted to deface the moon. They regarded him serenely with the stately smile they had worn so long, and which seemed to say, "Peck away, poor insect. We were not made to fear such as you. In 10 dragging ages we have seen more of your kind than there are sands at your feet. Have they left a blemish upon us?" But I am forgetting the Jaffa colonists. At Jaffa we had taken on board some 40 members of a very celebrated community. They were male and female, babies, young boys and young girls, young married people, and some who had passed a shade beyond the prime of life. I refer to the Adams Jaffa colony. Others had deserted before. We left in Jaffa Mr. Adams, his wife, and 15 unfortunates, who not only had no money but did not know where to turn or whither to go. Such was the statement made to us. Our 40 were miserable enough in the first place, and they lay about the decks seasick all the voyage, which about completed their misery, I take it. However, 1 or 2 young men remained upright, and by constant persecution we wormed out of them some little information. They gave it reluctantly and in a very fragmentary condition, for, having been shamefully humbugged by their prophet, they felt humiliated and unhappy. In such circumstances people do not like to talk. The colony was a complete fiasco. I have already said that such as could get away did so from time to time. The prophet Adams, once an actor, then several other things, afterward a Mormon and a missionary, always an adventurer, remains at Jaffa with his handful of sorrowful subjects. The 40 we brought away with us were chiefly destitute, though not all of them. They wished to get to Egypt. What might become of them then, they did not know and probably did not care anything to get away from hated Jaffa. They had little to hope for, because after many appeals to the sympathies of New England, made by strangers of Boston through the newspapers, and after the establishment of an office there for the reception of moneyed contributions for the Jaffa colonists, $1 was subscribed. The Consul General for Egypt showed me the newspaper paragraph which mentioned the circumstance, and mentioned also the discontinuance of the effort and the closing of the office. It was evident that practical New England was not sorry to be rid of such visionaries, and was not in the least inclined to hire anybody to bring them back to her. Still, to get to Egypt was something in the eyes of the unfortunate colonists, hopeful as the prospect seemed of ever getting further. Thus circumstanced, they landed at Alexandria from our ship. One of our passengers, Mr. Moses S. Beach, of the New York Sun, inquired of the Consul General what it would cost to send these people to their home in Maine by the way of Liverpool, and he said $1,500 in gold would do it. Mr. Beach gave his check for the money, and so the troubles of the Jaffa colonists were at an end. It was an unselfish act of benevolence. It was done without any ostentation, and has never been mentioned in any newspaper, I think. Therefore it is refreshing to learn now, several months after the above narrative was written, that another man received all the credit of this rescue of the colonists. Such is life. Alexandria was too much like a European city to be novel, and we soon tired of it. We took the cars and came up here to ancient Cairo, which is an Oriental city and of the completest pattern. There is little about it to disabuse one's mind of the error if he should take it into his head that he was in the heart of Arabia. Stately camels and dromedaries, swarthy Egyptians, and likewise Turks and black Ethiopians, turbaned, sashed, and blazing in a rich variety of Oriental costumes of all shades of flashy colors, are what one sees on every hand, crowding the narrow streets and the honeycombed bazaars. We are stopping at Shepherd's Hotel, which is the worst on earth except the one I stopped at once in a small town in the United States. It is pleasant to read this sketch in my notebook now, and know that I can stand Shepherd's Hotel, sure, because I have been in one just like it in America and survived. I stopped at the Benton House. It used to be a good hotel, but that proves nothing. I used to be a good boy, for that matter. Both of us have lost character of late years. The Benton is not a good hotel. The Benton lacks a very great deal of being a good hotel. Perdition is full of better hotels than the Benton. It was late at night when I got there, and I told the clerk I would like plenty of lights because I wanted to read an hour or two. When I reached number 15 with the porter, we came along a dim hall that was clad in ancient carpeting, faded, worn out in many places, and patched with old scraps of oilcloth, a hall that sank under one's feet and creaked dismally to every footstep. He struck a light, 2 inches of sallow, sorrowful, consumptive tallow candle that burned blue and sputtered and got discouraged and went out. The porter lit it again, and I asked if that was all the light the clerk sent. He said, "Oh, no, I've got another one here," and he produced another couple of inches of tallow candle. I said, "Light them both, I'll have to have one to see the other by." He did it, but the result was drearier than darkness itself. He was a cheery, accommodating rascal. He said he would go somewheres and steal a lamp. I abetted and encouraged him in his criminal design. I heard the landlord get after him in the hall 10 minutes afterwards. "Where are you going with that lamp?" 15 wants it, sir." 15? Why, he's got a double lot of candles. Does the man want to illuminate the house? Does he want to get up a torchlight procession? What is he up to, anyhow?" "He don't like them candles. Says he wants a lamp." "Why, what in the nation does what? I never heard of such a thing. What on earth can he want with that lamp?" "Well, he only wants to read, that's what he says." "Wants to read, does he? Ain't satisfied with 1,000 candles, but has to have a lamp. I do wonder what the devil that fellow wants that lamp for. Take him another candle, and then if—" "But he wants the lamp. Says he'll burn the old house down if he don't get a lamp," a remark which I never made. "I'd like to see him at it once." "Well, you take it along. But I swear it beats my time, though. and see if you can't find out what in the very nation he wants with that lamp." And he went off growling to himself, and still wondering and wondering over the unaccountable conduct of number 15. The lamp was a good one, but it revealed some disagreeable things. A bed in the suburbs of a desert of room, a bed that had hills and valleys in it, and you'd have to accommodate your body to the impression left in it by the man that slept there last, before you could lie comfortably. A carpet that had seen better days, a melancholy washstand in a remote corner, and a dejected pitcher on it, sorrowing over a broken nose. A looking-glass split across the center, which chopped your head off at the chin and made you look like some dreadful unfinished monster or other. The paper peeling in shreds from the walls. I sighed and said, "This is charming, and now don't you think you could get me something to read?" The porter said, "Oh, certainly. The old man's got dead loads of books," and he was gone before I could tell him what sort of literature I would rather have. And yet his countenance expressed the utmost confidence in his ability to execute the commission with credit to himself. The old man made a descent on him. "What are you going to do with that pile of books?" "15 wants 'em, sir." "15, is it? He'll want a warming pan next. He'll want a nurse. Take him everything there is in the house. Take him the barkeeper. Take him the baggage wagon. Take him a chambermaid. Confound me, I never saw anything like it. What did he say he wants with those books?"
"Wants to read 'em, like enough. It ain't likely he wants to eat 'em, I don't reckon."
"Wants to read 'em. Wants to read 'em at this time of night. The infernal lunatic. Well, he can't have 'em."
"But he says he's morally bound to have 'em. He says he'll just go a rarin' and a chargin' through this house and raisin' more. Well, there's no tellin' what he won't do if you don't get 'em. Because he's drunk and crazy and desperate, and nothing'll soothe him down but them cussed books." I had not made any threats, and was not in the condition ascribed to me by the porter.
"Well, go on. But I will be around when he goes to rarin' and chargin', and the first rare he makes, I'll make him rare out of the window."
And then the old gentleman went off growling as before. The genius of that porter was something wonderful. He put an armful of books on the bed and said, "Good night," as confidently as he knew perfectly well that those books were exactly my style of reading matter. And well he might. His selection covered the whole range of legitimate literature. It comprised The Great Consummation by Reverend Dr. Cummings, theology; Revised Statutes of the State of Missouri, law; The Complete Horse Doctor, medicine; The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo, romance; the works of William Shakespeare, poetry. I shall never cease to admire the tact and the intelligence of that gifted porter. But all the donkeys in Christendom, and most of the Egyptian boys, I think, are at the door. And there is some noise going on. Not to put it in stronger language, we are about starting to the illustrious pyramids of Egypt, and the donkeys for the voyage are under inspection. I will go and select one before the choice animals are all taken. End of chapter 57. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 58. Recherche donkeys. A wild ride. Specimens of Egyptian modesty. Moses in the bulrushes. Place where the Holy Family sojourned. Distant view of the pyramids. A nearer view. The ascent. Superb view from the top of the pyramid. Bakshish, bakshish. An Arab exploit. In the bowels of the pyramid. Strategy. Reminiscence of Holliday's Hill. Boyish exploit. The majestic Sphinx. Things the author will not tell. Grand old Egypt. The donkeys were all good, all handsome, all strong, and in good condition, all fast, and all willing to prove it. They were the best we had found anywhere, and the most recherche. I do not know what recherche is, but that is what these donkeys were, anyhow. Some were of a soft mouse color, and the others were white, black, and vari-colored. Some were close-shaven all over, except that a tuft like a paint-brush was left on the end of the tail. Others were so shaven in fanciful landscape garden patterns as to mark their bodies with curving lines, which were bounded on one side by hair and on the other by the close plush left by the shears. They had all been newly barbered, and were exceedingly stylish. Several of the white ones were barred like zebras, with rainbow stripes of blue and red and yellow paint. These were indescribably gorgeous. Dan and Jack selected from this lot because they brought back Italian reminiscences of the old masters. The saddles were the high, stuffy, frog-shaped things we had known in Ephesus and Smyrna. The donkey boys were lively young Egyptian rascals who could follow a donkey and keep him in a canter half a day without tiring. We had plenty of spectators when we mounted, for the hotel was full of English people bound overland to India, and officers getting ready for the African campaign against the Abyssinian King Theodorus. We were not a very large party, but as we charged through the streets of the great metropolis we made noise for 500, and displayed activity and created excitement in proportion. Nobody can steer a donkey, and some collided with camels, dervishes, effendis, asses, beggars, and everything else that offered to the donkeys a reasonable chance for a collision. When we turned into the broad avenue that leads out of the city toward Old Cairo, there was plenty of room. The walls of stately date palms that fenced the gardens and bordered the way threw their shadows down and made the air cool and bracing. We rose to the spirit of the time, and the race became a wild rout, a stampede, a terrific panic. I wish to live to enjoy it again. Somewhere along this route we had a few startling exhibitions of Oriental simplicity. A girl, apparently 13 years of age, came along the great thoroughfare dressed like Eve before the fall. We would have called her 13 at home, but here girls who look 13 are often not more than 9 in reality. Occasionally we saw stark-naked men of superb build bathing and making no attempt at concealment. However, an hour's acquaintance with this cheerful custom reconciled the pilgrims to it, and then it ceased to occasion remark. Thus easily do even the most startling novelties grow tame and spiritless to these sight-surfeited wanderers. Arrived at Old Cairo, the camp followers took up the donkeys and tumbled them bodily aboard a small boat with a lateen sail, and we followed and got under way. The deck was closely packed with donkeys and men. The two sailors had to climb over and under and through the wedged mast to work the sails, and the steersman had to crowd 4 or 5 donkeys out of the way when he wished to swing his tiller and put his helm hard down. But what were their troubles to us? We had nothing to do but enjoy the trip, nothing to do but shove the donkeys off our corns and look at the charming scenery of the Nile. On the island at our right was the machine they call the Nilometer, a stone column whose business it is to mark the rise of the river and prophesy whether it will reach only 32 feet and produce a famine, or whether it will properly flood the land at 40 and produce plenty, or whether it will rise to 43 and bring death and destruction to flocks and crops. But how it does all this they could not explain to us so that we could understand. On the same island is still shown the spot where Pharaoh's daughter found Moses in the bulrushes. Near the spot we sailed from, the Holy Family dwelt when they sojourned in Egypt, till Herod should complete his slaughter of the innocents. The same tree they rested under when they first arrived was there a short time ago, but the Viceroy of Egypt sent it to the Empress Eugenie lately. He was just in time, otherwise our pilgrims would have had it. The Nile at this point is muddy, swift, and turbid, and does not lack a great deal of being as wide as the Mississippi. We scrambled up the steep bank at the shabby town of Giza, mounted the donkeys again, and scampered away. For 4 or 5 miles the route lay along a high embankment which they say is to be the bed of a railway the Sultan means to build for no other reason than that when the Empress of the French comes to visit him she can go to the pyramids in comfort. This is true Oriental hospitality. I am very glad it is our privilege to have donkeys instead of cars. At the distance of a few miles the pyramids rising above the palms looked very clean-cut, very grand and imposing, and very soft and filmy as well. They swam in a rich haze that took from them all suggestions of unfeeling stone, and made them seem only the airy nothings of a dream, structures which might blossom into tiers of vague arches, or ornate colonnades, maybe, and change again into all graceful forms of architecture while we looked, and then melt deliciously away and blend with the tremulous atmosphere. At the end of the levee we left the mules and went in a sailboat across an arm of the Nile or an overflow, and landed where the sands of the Great Sahara left their embankment, as straight as a wall, along the verge of the alluvial plain of the river. A laborious walk in the flaming sun brought us to the foot of the great Pyramid of Cheops. It was a fairy vision no longer. It was a corrugated, unsightly mountain of stone. Each of its monstrous sides was a wide stairway which rose upward step above step, narrowing as it went, till it tapered to a point far aloft in the air. Insect men and women, pilgrims from the Quaker City, were creeping about its dizzy perches, and one little black swarm were waving postage stamps from the airy summit. Handkerchiefs will be understood. Of course, we were besieged by a rabble of muscular Egyptians and Arabs who wanted the contract of dragging us to the top. All tourists are. Of course, you could not hear your own voice for the din that was around you. Of course, the sheiks said they were the only responsible parties, that all contracts must be made with them, all moneys paid over to them, and none exacted from us by any but themselves alone. Of course they contracted that the varlets who dragged us up should not mention bucksheesh once, for such is the usual routine. Of course we contracted with them, paid them, were delivered into the hands of the draggers, dragged up the pyramids, and harried and bedeviled for bucksheesh from the foundation clear to the summit. We paid it, too, for we were purposely spread very far apart over the vast side of the pyramid. There was no help near if we called, and the Herculeses who dragged us had a way of asking sweetly and flatteringly for bucksheesh, which was seductive, and of looking fierce and threatening to throw us down the precipice, which was persuasive and convincing. Each step being full as high as a dinner table, there being very, very many of the steps, an Arab having hold of each of our arms and springing upward from step to step and snatching us with them, forcing us to lift our feet as high as our breasts every time, and do it rapidly and keep it up till we were ready to faint, who shall say it is not lively, exhilarating, lacerating, muscle-straining, bone-wrenching, and perfectly excruciating and exhausting pastime, climbing the pyramids? I beseeched the varlets not to twist all my joints asunder. I iterated, reiterated, even swore to them that I did not wish to beat anybody to the top, did all I could to convince them that if I got there the last of all I would feel blessed above men and grateful to them forever. I begged them, prayed them, pleaded with them to let me stop and rest a moment, only one little moment, and they only answered with some more frightful springs, and an unenlisted volunteer behind opened a bombardment of determined boosts with his head which threatened to batter my whole political economy to wreck and ruin. Twice for 1 minute they let me rest while they extorted bucksheesh, and then continued their maniac flight up the pyramid. They wished to beat the other parties. It was nothing to them that I, a stranger, must be sacrificed upon the altar of their unholy ambition. But in the midst of sorrow, joy blooms. Even in this dark hour I had a sweet consolation, for I knew that except these Mohammedans repented, they would go straight to perdition some day, and they never repent, they never forsake their paganism. This thought calmed me, cheered me, and I sank down, limp and exhausted, upon the summit, but happy, so happy and serene within. On the one hand, a mighty sea of yellow sand stretched away toward the ends of the earth, solemn, silent, shorn of vegetation, its solitude uncheered by any forms of creature life. On the other, the Eden of Egypt was spread below us, a broad green floor, cloven by the sinuous river, dotted with villages, its vast distances measured and marked by the diminishing stature of receding clusters of palms. It lay asleep in an enchanted atmosphere. There was no sound, no motion. Above the date plumes in the middle distance swelled a domed and pinnacled mass, glimmering through a tinted, exquisite mist. Away toward the horizon a dozen shapely pyramids watched over ruined Memphis, and at our feet the bland, impassible Sphinx looked out upon the picture from her throne in the sands as placidly and pensively as she had looked upon its like full 50 lagging centuries ago. We suffered torture no pen can describe from the hungry appeals for bucksheesh that gleamed from Arab eyes and poured incessantly from Arab lips. Why try to call up the traditions of vanished Egyptian grandeur? Why try to fancy Egypt following dead Ramses to his tomb in the pyramid, or the long multitude of Israel departing over the desert yonder? Why try to think at all? The thing was impossible. One must bring his meditations cut and dried, or else cut and dry them afterward. The traditional Arab proposed, in the traditional way, to run down Cheops, cross the eighth of a mile of sand intervening between it and the tall pyramid of Cephron, ascend to Cephron's summit, and return to us on the top of Cheops, all in 9 minutes by the watch, and the whole service to be rendered for a single dollar. In the first flush of irritation I said, let the Arab and his exploits go to the mischief. But stay. The upper third of Cephron was coated with dressed marble, smooth as glass. A blessed thought entered my brain. He must infallibly break his neck. Close the contract with dispatch, I said, and let him go. He started. We watched. He went bounding down the vast broadside spring after spring like an ibex. He grew small and smaller till he became a bobbing pygmy, away down toward the bottom, then disappeared. We turned and peered over the other side. 40 seconds, 80 seconds, 100. Happiness, he is dead already. 2 minutes and a quarter. There he goes. Too true. It was too true. He was very small now. Gradually but surely he overcame the level ground. He began to spring and climb again. Up, up, up. At last he reached the smooth coating. Now for it. But he clung to it with toes and fingers like a fly. He crawled this way and that, away to the right, slanting upward, away to the left, still slanting upward, and stood, at last, a black peg on the summit, and waved his pygmy scarf. Then he crept downward to the raw steps again, then picked up his agile heels and flew. We lost him presently, but presently again we saw him under us, mounting with undiminished energy. Shortly he bounded into our midst with a gallant war whoop. Time, 8 minutes, 41 seconds. He had won. His bones were intact. It was a failure. I reflected. I said to myself, he is tired, and must grow dizzy. I will risk another dollar on him. He started again, made the trip again, slipped on the smooth coating. I almost had him. But an infamous crevice saved him. He was with us once more, perfectly sound. Time, 8 minutes, 46 seconds. I said to Dan, lend me a dollar. I can beat this game yet. Worse and worse. He won again. Time, 8 minutes, 48 seconds. I was out of all patience now. I was desperate. Money was no longer of any consequence. I said, Sirrah, I will give you $100 to jump off this pyramid head first. If you do not like the terms, name your bet. I scorn to stand on expenses now. I will stay right here and risk money on you as long as Dan has got a cent. I was in a fair way to win now, for it was a dazzling opportunity for an Arab. He pondered a moment, and would have done it, I think, but his mother arrived then and interfered. Her tears moved me. I never can look upon the tears of woman with indifference, and I said I would give her $100 to jump off too. But it was a failure. The Arabs are too high-priced in Egypt. They put on airs unbecoming to such savages. We descended, hot and out of humor. The dragoman lit the candles, and we all entered a hole near the base of the pyramid, attended by a crazy rabble of Arabs who thrust their services upon us uninvited. They dragged us up a long inclined chute, and dripped candle grease all over us. This chute was not more than twice as wide and high as a Saratoga trunk, and was walled, roofed, and floored with solid blocks of Egyptian granite as wide as a wardrobe, twice as thick, and 3 times as long. We kept on climbing through the oppressive gloom till I thought we ought to be nearing the top of the pyramid again, and then came to the Queen's Chamber, and shortly to the Chamber of the King. These large apartments were tombs. The walls were built of monstrous masses of smooth granite, neatly joined together. Some of them were nearly as large square as an ordinary parlor. A great stone sarcophagus like a bathtub stood in the center of the king's chamber. Around it were gathered a picturesque group of Arab savages and soiled and tattered pilgrims, who held their candles aloft in the gloom while they chattered, and the winking blurs of light shed a dim glory down upon one of the irrepressible memento-seekers who was pecking at the venerable sarcophagus with his sacrilegious hammer. We struggled out to the open air and the bright sunshine, and for the space of 30 minutes received ragged Arabs by couples, dozens, and platoons, and paid them bakshish for services they swore and proved by each other that they had rendered, but which we had not been aware of before, and as each party was paid, they dropped into the rear of the procession, and in due time arrived again with a newly invented delinquent list for liquidation. We lunched in the shade of the pyramid, and in the midst of this encroaching and unwelcome company, and then Dan and Jack and I started away for a walk. A howling swarm of beggars followed us, surrounded us, almost headed us off. A sheik, in flowing white burnous and gaudy headgear, was with them. He wanted more bakshish, but we had adopted a new code. It was millions for defense, but not a cent for bakshish. I asked him if he could persuade the others to depart if we paid him. He said yes, for 10 francs. We accepted the contract, and said, "Now, persuade your vassals to fall back." He swung his long staff around his head, and 3 Arabs bit the dust. He capered among the mob like a very maniac. His blows fell like hail, and wherever one fell a subject went down. We had to hurry to the rescue and tell him it was only necessary to damage them a little. He need not kill them. In 2 minutes we were alone with the sheik, and remained so. The persuasive powers of this illiterate savage were remarkable. Each side of the Pyramid of Cheops is about as long as the Capitol at Washington, or the Sultan's new palace on the Bosporus, and is longer than the greatest depth of St. Peter's at Rome, which is to say that each side of Cheops extends 700 and some odd feet. It is about 75 feet higher than the cross of St. Peter's. The first time I ever went down the Mississippi, I thought the highest bluff on the river between St. Louis and the New Orleans it was near Selma, Missouri was probably the highest mountain in the world. It is 413 feet high. It still looms in my memory with undiminished grandeur. I can still see the trees and bushes growing smaller and smaller as I followed them up its huge slant with my eye, till they became a feathery fringe on the distant summit. This symmetrical pyramid of Cheops, this solid mountain of stone reared by the patient hands of men, this mighty tomb of a forgotten monarch, dwarfs my cherished mountain, for it is 480 feet high. In still earlier years than those I have been recalling, Holliday's Hill, in our town, was to me the noblest work of God. It appeared to pierce the skies. It was nearly 300 feet high. In those days I pondered the subject much, but I never could understand why it did not swathe its summit with never-failing clouds, and crown its majestic brow with everlasting snows. I had heard that such was the custom of great mountains in other parts of the world. I remembered how I worked with another boy at odd afternoons stolen from study, and paid for with stripes, to undermine and start from its bed an immense boulder that rested upon the edge of that hilltop. I remembered now, one Saturday afternoon, we gave 3 hours of honest effort to the task, and saw at last that our reward was at hand. I remembered how we sat down then, and wiped the perspiration away, and waited to let a picnic party get out of the way in the road below, and then we started the boulder. It was splendid. It went crashing down the hillside, tearing up saplings, mowing bushes down like grass, ripping and crushing and smashing everything in its path, eternally splintered and scattered a wood pile at the foot of the hill, and then sprang from the high bank clear over a dray in the road. The negro glanced up once and dodged, and the next second it made infinitesimal mincemeat of a frame cooper shop, and the coopers swarmed out like bees. Then we said it was perfectly magnificent, and left, because the coopers were starting up the hill to inquire. Still, that mountain, prodigious as it was nothing to the Pyramid of Cheops. I could conjure up no comparison that would convey to my mind a satisfactory comprehension of the magnitude of a pile of monstrous stones that covered 13 acres of ground and stretched upward 480 tiresome feet, and so I gave it up and walked down to the Sphinx. After years of waiting, it was before me at last. The great face was so sad, so earnest, so longing, so patient. There was a dignity not of the earth in its mien, and in its countenance a benignity such as never any human wore.
It was stone, but it seemed sentient. If ever image of stone thought, it was thinking. It was looking toward the verge of the landscape, yet looking at nothing nothing but distance and vacancy. It was looking over and beyond everything of the present and far into the past. It was gazing out over the ocean of time, over lines of century waves which, further and further receding, closed nearer and nearer together, and blended at last into one unbroken tide, away toward the horizon of remote antiquity. It was thinking of the wars of departed ages, of the empires it had seen created and destroyed, of the nations whose birth it had witnessed, whose progress it had watched, whose annihilation it had noted, of the joy and sorrow, the life and death, the grandeur and decay, of 5,000 slow revolving years. It was the type of an attribute of man, of a faculty, of his heart and brain. It was memory, retrospection, wrought into visible, tangible form. All who know what pathos there is in memories of days that are accomplished and faces that have vanished, albeit only a trifling score of years gone by, will have some appreciation of the pathos that dwells in these grave eyes that look so steadfastly back upon the things they knew before history was born, before tradition had being, things that were and forms that moved in a vague era which even poetry and romance scarce know of, and passed one by one away, and left the stony dreamer solitary in the midst of a strange new age and uncomprehended scenes. The Sphinx is grand in its loneliness, it is imposing in its magnitude, it is impressive in the mystery that hangs over its story. And there is that in the overshadowing majesty of this eternal figure of stone, with its accusing memory of the deeds of all ages, which reveals to one something of what he shall feel when he shall stand at last in the awful presence of God. There are some things which, for the credit of America, should be left unsaid, perhaps, but these very things happen sometimes to be the very things which, for the real benefit of Americans, ought to have prominent notice. While we stood looking, a wart, or an excrescence of some kind, appeared on the jaw of the Sphinx. We heard the familiar clink of a hammer, and understood the case at once. One of our well-meaning reptiles, relic hunters, had crawled up there and was trying to break a specimen from the face of this, the most majestic creation the hand of man has wrought. But the great image contemplated the dead ages as calmly as ever, unconscious of the small insect that was fretting at its jaw. Egyptian granite that has defied the storms and earthquakes of all time has nothing to fear from the tack-hammers of ignorant excursionists, highwaymen like this specimen. He failed in his enterprise. We sent a sheik to arrest him if he had the authority, or to warn him if he had not, that by the laws of Egypt the crime he was attempting to commit was punishable with imprisonment or the bastinado. Then he desisted and went away. The Sphinx, 125 feet long, 60 feet high, and 102 feet around the head, if I remember rightly, carved out of one solid block of stone harder than any iron. The block must have been as large as the Fifth Avenue Hotel before the usual waste, by the necessities of sculpture, of a fourth or a half of the original mass was begun. I only set down these figures and these remarks to suggest the prodigious labor the carving of it so elegantly, so symmetrically, so faultlessly must have cost. This species of stone is so hard that figures cut in it remain sharp and unmarred after exposure to the weather for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Now did it take 100 years of patient toil to carve the Sphinx? Seems probable. Something interfered, and we did not visit the Red Sea and walk upon the sands of Arabia. I shall not describe the great mosque of Mehemet Ali, whose entire inner walls are built of polished and glistening alabaster. I shall not tell how the little birds have built their nests in the globes of the great chandeliers that hang in the mosque, and how they fill the whole place with their music, and are not afraid of anybody because their audacity is pardoned. Their rights are respected, and nobody is allowed to interfere with them, even though the mosque be thus doomed to go unlighted. I certainly shall not tell the hackneyed story of the massacre of the Mamelukes, because I am glad the lawless rascals were massacred, and I do not wish to get up any sympathy in their behalf. I shall not tell how that one solitary Mameluke jumped his horse 100 feet down from the battlements of the citadel and escaped, because I do not think much of that.
I could have done it myself. I shall not tell of Joseph's well which he dug in the solid rock of the Citadel Hill, and which is still as good as new, nor how the same mules he bought to draw up the water, with an endless chain, are still at it yet, and are getting tired of it too. I shall not tell about Joseph's granaries, which he built to store the grain in, what time the Egyptian brokers were selling short, unwitting that there would be no corn in all the land when it should be time for them to deliver. I shall not tell anything about the strange, strange city of Cairo, because it is only a repetition, a good deal intensified and exaggerated, of the Oriental cities I have already spoken of. I shall not tell of the great caravan which leaves for Mecca every year, for I did not see it, nor of the fashion the people have of prostrating themselves and so forming a long human pavement to be ridden over by the chief of the expedition on its return, to the end that their salvation may be thus secured, for I did not see that either. I shall not speak of the railway, for it is like any other railway. I shall only say that the fuel they use for the locomotive is composed of mummies 3,000 years old, purchased by the ton or by the graveyard for that purpose, and that sometimes one hears the profane engineer call out pettishly, "Damn these plebeians! They don't burn worth a cent! Pass out a king!" Stated to me for a fact. I only tell it as I got it. I am willing to believe it. I can believe anything. I shall not tell of the groups of mud cones stuck like wasps' nests upon 1,000 mounds above high water mark, the length and breadth of Egypt, villages of the lower classes. I shall not speak of the boundless sweep of level plain, green with luxuriant grain, that gladdens the eye as far as it can pierce through the soft, rich atmosphere of Egypt. I shall not speak of the vision of the pyramid seen at a distance of 25 miles, for the picture is too ethereal to be limned by uninspired pen. I shall not tell of the crowds of dusky women who flocked to the cars, when they stopped a moment at a station, to sell us a drink of water or a ruddy, juicy pomegranate. I shall not tell of the motley multitudes and wild costumes that graced a fair we found in full blast at another barbarous station. I shall not tell how we feasted on fresh dates and enjoyed the pleasant landscape all through the flying journey, nor how we thundered into Alexandria at last, swarmed out of the cars, rowed aboard the ship, left a comrade behind who was to return to Europe, thence home, raised the anchor, and turned our bows homeward finally and forever from the long voyage; nor how, as the mellow sun went down upon the oldest land on earth, Jack and Moult assembled in solemn state in the smoking room, and mourned over the lost comrade the whole night long, and would not be comforted. I shall not speak a word of any of these things, or write a line. They shall be as a sealed book. I do not know what a sealed book is, because I never saw one, but a sealed book is the expression to use in this connection, because it is popular. We were glad to have seen the land which was the mother of civilization, which taught Greece her letters, and through Greece Rome, and through Rome the world, the land which could have humanized and civilized the hapless children of Israel, but allowed them to depart out of her borders little better than savages. We were glad to have seen that land which had an enlightened religion, with future eternal rewards and punishment in it, while even Israel's religion contained no promise of a hereafter. We were glad to have seen that land which had glass 3,000 years before England had it, and could paint upon it as none of us can paint now. That land which knew, 3,000 years ago, well nigh all of medicine and surgery which science has discovered lately, which had all those curious surgical instruments which science has invented recently, which had in high excellence 1,000 luxuries and necessities of an advanced civilization which we have gradually contrived and accumulated in modern times, and claimed as things that were new under the sun, that had paper untold centuries before we dreamt of it, and waterfalls before our women thought of them, that had a perfect system of common schools so long before we boasted of our achievements in that direction that it seems forever and forever ago, that so embalmed the dead that flesh was made almost immortal, which we cannot do, that built temples which mock at destroying time and smile grimly upon our lauded little prodigies of architecture, that old land that knew all which we know now, perchance, and more, that walked in the broad highway of civilization in the gray dawn of creation ages and ages before we were born, that left the impress of exalted, cultivated mind upon the eternal front of the Sphinx to confound all scoffers who, when all her other proofs had passed away, might seek to persuade the world that imperial Egypt, in the days of her high renown, had groped in darkness. End of chapter 58. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 59. Going Home. A demoralized notebook. A boy's diary. Mere mention of old Spain. Departure from Cadiz. A deserved rebuke. The beautiful Madeiras. Tabooed. In the delightful Bermudas. An English welcome. Goodbye to our friends the Bermudians. Packing trunks for home. Our first accident. The long cruise drawing to a close. At home. Amen. We were at sea now, for a very long voyage. We were to pass through the entire length of the Levant, through the entire length of the Mediterranean proper also, and then cross the full width of the Atlantic, a voyage of several weeks. We naturally settled down into a very slow, stay-at-home manner of life, and resolved to be quiet, exemplary people, and roam no more for 20 or 30 days, no more, at least, than from the stem to stern of the ship. It was a very comfortable prospect, though, for we were tired, and needed a long rest. We were all lazy and satisfied now, as the meager entries in my notebook, that sure index to me of my condition, prove. What a stupid thing a notebook gets to be at sea, anyway. Please observe the style. Sunday, services, as usual, at 4 bells. Services at night, also. No cards. Monday, beautiful day, but rained hard. The cattle purchased at Alexandria for beef ought to be shingled, or else fattened. The water stands in deep puddles in the depressions forward of their after shoulders, also here and there all over their backs. It is well they are not cows. It would soak in and ruin the milk. The poor devil eagle, afterwards presented to the Central Park, from Syria looks miserable and droopy in the rain, perched on the forward capstan. He appears to have his own opinion of a sea voyage, and if it were put into language and the language solidified, it would probably essentially damn the widest river in the world. Tuesday, somewhere in the neighborhood of the island of Malta. Cannot stop there. Cholera. Weather very stormy. Many passengers seasick and invisible. Wednesday, weather still very savage. Storm blew 2 land birds to sea, and they came on board. A hawk was blown off, also. He circled round and round the ship, wanting to light, but afraid of the people. He was so tired, though, that he had to light at last, or perish. He stopped in the foretop, repeatedly, and was as often blown away by the wind. At last Harry caught him. Sea full of flying fish. They rise in flocks of 300, and flash along above the tops of the waves a distance of 200 or 300 feet, then fall and disappear. Thursday, anchored off Algiers, Africa. Beautiful city, beautiful green hilly landscape behind it. Stayed half a day and left. Not permitted to land, though we showed a clean bill of health. They were afraid of Egyptian plague and cholera. Friday, morning dominoes, afternoon dominoes, evening promenading the deck. Afterwards, charades. Saturday, morning dominoes, afternoon dominoes, evening promenading the decks, afterwards dominoes. Sunday, morning service 4 bells, evening service 8 bells, monotony till midnight, whereupon dominoes. Monday, morning dominoes, afternoon dominoes, evening promenading the decks, afterward charades and a lecture from Dr. C. Dominoes. No date. Anchored off the picturesque city of Cagliari, Sardinia. Stayed till midnight, but not permitted to land by these infamous foreigners. They smell inodorously. They do not wash. They dare not risk cholera. Thursday, anchored off the beautiful cathedral city of Malaga, Spain. Went ashore in the captain's boat. Not ashore either, for they would not let us land. Quarantine. Shipped my newspaper correspondence, which they took with tongs, dipped it in sea water, clipped it full of holes, and then fumigated it with villainous vapors till it smelt like a Spaniard. Inquired about chances to run to blockade and visit the Alhambra at Granada. Too risky, they might hang a body. Set sail, middle of afternoon. And so on, and so on, and so forth, for several days. Finally anchored off Gibraltar, which looks familiar and homelike. It reminds me of the journal I opened with the New Year once, when I was a boy, and a confiding and a willing prey to those impossible schemes of reform which well-meaning old maids and grandmothers set for the feet of unwary youths at that season of the year, setting oversized tasks for them, which, necessarily failing, as unfailingly weaken the boy's strength of will, diminish his confidence in himself, and injure his chances of success in life. Please accept of an extract. Monday. Got up, washed, went to bed. Tuesday. Got up, washed, went to bed. Wednesday. Got up, washed, went to bed. Thursday. Got up, washed, went to bed. Friday. Got up, washed, went to bed. Next Friday. Got up, washed, went to bed. Friday fortnight. Got up, washed, went to bed. Following month. Got up, washed, went to bed. I stopped then, discouraged. Startling events appeared to be too rare in my career to render a diary necessary. I still reflect with pride, however, that even at that early age I washed when I got up. That journal finished me. I never have had the nerve to keep one since. My loss of confidence in myself in that line was permanent. The ship had to stay a week or more at Gibraltar to take in coal for the home voyage. It would be very tiresome staying here, and so 4 of us ran the quarantine blockade, and spent 7 delightful days in Seville, Cordova, Cadiz, and wandering through the pleasant rural scenery of Andalusia, the garden of old Spain. The experiences of that cheery week were too varied and numerous for a short chapter, and I have not room for a long one. Therefore, I shall leave them all out. End of Chapter 59. Chapter 60. Thankless Devotion. A Newspaper Valedictory. Conclusion. 10 or 11 o'clock found us coming down to breakfast one morning in Cadiz. They told us the ship had been lying at anchor in the harbor 2 or 3 hours. It was time for us to bestir ourselves. The ship could wait only a little while because of the quarantine. We were soon on board, and within the hour the white city and the pleasant shores of Spain sank down behind the waves and passed out of sight. We had seen no land fade from view so regretfully. It had long ago been decided in a noisy public meeting in the main cabin that we could not go to Lisbon, because we must surely be quarantined there. We did everything by mass meeting, in the good old national way, from swapping off one empire for another on the program of the voyage, down to complaining of the cookery and the scarcity of napkins. I am reminded now of one of these complaints of the cookery made by a passenger. The coffee had been steadily growing more and more execrable for the space of 3 weeks, till at last it had ceased to be coffee altogether, and had assumed the nature of mere discolored water. So this person said. He said it was so weak that it was transparent, an inch in depth around the edge of the cup. As he approached the table one morning, he saw the transparent edge, by means of his extraordinary vision, long before he got to his seat. He went back and complained in a high-handed way to Captain Duncan. He said the coffee was disgraceful. The captain showed his. It seemed tolerably good. The incipient mutineer was more outraged than ever, then, at what he denounced as the partiality shown the captain's table over the other tables in the ship. He flourished back, and got his cup, and set it down triumphantly, and said, "Just try that mixture once, Captain Duncan." He smelt it, tasted it, smiled benignantly, then said, "It is inferior for coffee, but it is pretty fair tea." The humbled mutineer smelt it, tasted it, and returned to his seat. He had made an egregious ass of himself before the whole ship. He did it no more. After that he took things as they came. That was me. The old-fashioned ship life had returned, now that we were no longer in sight of land. For days and days it continued just the same, one day being exactly like another, and, to me, every one of them pleasant. At last we anchored in the open roadstead of Funchal, in the beautiful islands we call the Madeiras. The mountains looked surpassingly lovely, clad as they were in living green, ribbed with lava ridges, flecked with white cottages, riven by deep chasms purple with shade, the great slopes dashed with sunshine and mottled with shadows flung from the drifting squadrons of the sky, and the superb picture fitly crowned by towering peaks whose fronts were swept by the trailing fringes of the clouds. But we could not land. We stayed all day and looked. We abused the man who invented quarantine. We held half a dozen mass meetings and crammed them full of interrupted speeches, motions that fell stillborn, amendments that came to naught, and resolutions that died from sheer exhaustion in trying to get before the House. At night we set sail. We averaged 4 mass meetings a week for the voyage. We seemed always in labor in this way, and yet so often fallaciously that whenever at long intervals we were safely delivered of a resolution, it was cause for public rejoicing, and we hoisted the flag and fired a salute. Days passed, and nights, and then the beautiful Bermudas rose out of the sea. We entered the tortuous channel, steamed hither and thither among the bright summer islands, and rested at last under the flag of England, and were welcome. We were not a nightmare here, where were civilization and intelligence in place of Spanish and Italian superstition, dirt, and dread of cholera. A few days among the breezy groves, the flower gardens, the coral caves, and the lovely vistas of blue water that went curving in and out, disappearing and anon again appearing through jungle walls of brilliant foliage, restored the energies dulled by long drowsing on the ocean, and fitted us for our final cruise, our little run of 1,000 miles to New York, America, home. We bade good-bye to our friends the Bermudians, as our program hath it (the majority of those we were most intimate with were negroes), and courted the great deep again. I said the majority. We knew more negroes than white people, because we had a deal of washing to be done. But we made some most excellent friends among the whites, whom it will be a pleasant duty to hold long in grateful remembrance. We sailed, and from that hour all idling ceased. Such another system of overhauling, general littering of cabins, and packing of trunks we had not seen since we let go the anchor in the harbor of Beirut. Everybody was busy. Lists of all purchases had to be made out, and values attached, to facilitate matters at the custom house. Purchases bought by bulk in partnership had to be equitably divided, outstanding debts canceled, accounts compared, and trunks, boxes, and packages labeled. All day long the bustle and confusion continued, and now came our first accident. A passenger was running through a gangway, between decks, one stormy night, when he caught his foot in the iron staple of a door that had been heedlessly left off a hatchway, and the bones of his right leg broke at the ankle. It was our first serious misfortune. We had traveled much more than 20,000 miles by land and sea, in many trying climates, without a single hurt, without a serious case of sickness, and without a death among 5 and 60 passengers. Our good fortune had been wonderful. A sailor had jumped overboard at Constantinople one night, and was seen no more, but it was suspected that his object was to desert, and there was a slim chance, at least, that he reached the shore. But the passenger list was complete. There was no name missing from the register. At last, one pleasant morning, we steamed up the harbor of New York, all on deck, all dressed in Christian garb, by special order, for there was a latent disposition in some quarters to come out as Turks, and amid a waving of handkerchiefs from welcoming friends, the glad pilgrims noted the shiver of the decks that told that ship and pier had joined hands again, and the long, strange cruise was over. Amen. End of chapter 60. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 61. In this place I will print an article which I wrote for the New York Herald the night we arrived. I do it partly because my contract with my publishers makes it compulsory, partly because it is a proper, tolerably accurate, and exhaustive summing up of the cruise of the ship and the performances of the pilgrims in foreign lands, and partly because some of the passengers have abused me for writing it, and I wish the public to see how thankless a task it is to put one's self to trouble to glorify unappreciative people. I was charged with rushing into print with these compliments. I did not rush. I had written news letters to the Herald sometimes, but yet when I visited the office that day I did not say anything about writing a valedictory. I did go to the Tribune office to see if such an article was wanted, because I belonged on the regular staff of that paper, and it was simply a duty to do it. The managing editor was absent, and so I thought no more about it. At night, when the Herald's request came for an article, I did not rush. In fact, I demurred for a while, because I did not feel like writing compliments then, and therefore was afraid to speak of the cruise lest I might be betrayed into using other than complimentary language. However, I reflected that it would be a just and righteous thing to go down and write a kind word for the Hajis. Hajis are people who have made the pilgrimage, because parties not interested could not do it so feelingly as I, a fellow Haji, and so I penned the valedictory. I have read it, and read it again, and if there is a sentence in it that is not fulsomely complimentary to captain, ship, and passengers, I cannot find it. If it is not a chapter that any company might be proud to have a body write about them, my judgment is fit for nothing. With these remarks I confidently submit it to the unprejudiced judgment of the reader. Return of the Holy Land Excursionists. The Story of the Cruise. To the Editor of the Herald. The steamer Quaker City has accomplished at last her extraordinary voyage, and returned to her old pier at the foot of Wall Street. The expedition was a success in some respects, in some it was not. Originally it was advertised as a pleasure excursion. Well, perhaps it was a pleasure excursion, but certainly it did not look like one. Certainly it did not act like one. Anybody's and everybody's notion of a pleasure excursion is that the parties to it will of a necessity be young and giddy and somewhat boisterous. They will dance a good deal, sing a good deal, make love, but sermonize very little. Anybody's and everybody's notion of a well-conducted funeral is that there must be a hearse and a corpse, and chief mourners, and mourners by courtesy, many old people, much solemnity, no levity, and a prayer and a sermon withal. 3/4 of the Quaker City's passengers were between 40 and 70 years of age. There was a picnic crowd for you. It may be supposed that the other fourth was composed of young girls, but it was not. It was chiefly composed of rusty old bachelors and a child of 6 years. Let us average the ages of the Quaker City's pilgrims and set the figure down as 50 years. Is any man insane enough to imagine that this picnic of patriarchs sang, made love, danced, laughed, told anecdotes, dealt in ungodly levity? In my experience they sinned little in these matters. No doubt it was presumed here at home that these frolicsome veterans laughed and sang and romped all day, and day after day, and kept up a noisy excitement from one end of the ship to the other, and that they played blind man's buff, or danced quadrilles and waltzes on moonlight evenings on the quarter-deck, and that at odd moments of unoccupied time they jotted a laconic item or two in the journals they opened on such an elaborate plan when they left home, and then scurried off to their whist and euchre labors under the cabin lamps. If these things were presumed, the presumption was at fault. The venerable excursionists were not gay and frisky. They played no blind man's buff. They dealt not in whist. They shirked not the irksome journal, for, alas, most of them were even writing books. They never romped, they talked but little, they never sang, save in the nightly prayer meeting. The pleasure ship was a synagogue, and the pleasure trip was a funeral excursion without a corpse. There is nothing exhilarating about a funeral excursion without a corpse. A free, hearty laugh was a sound that was not heard oftener than once in 7 days about those decks or in those cabins, and when it was heard it met with precious little sympathy. The excursions danced on 3 separate evenings, long, long ago, it seems an age.
quadrilles of a single set made up of 3 ladies and 5 gentlemen, the latter with handkerchiefs around their arms to signify their sex, who timed their feet to the solemn wheezing of a melodeon. But even this melancholy orgy was voted to be sinful, and dancing was discontinued. The Pilgrims played dominoes when too much Josephus or Robinson's Holy Land researches or book writing made recreation necessary, for dominoes is about as mild and sinless a game as any in the world, perhaps, excepting always the ineffably insipid diversion they call croquet, which is a game where you don't pocket any balls and don't carom on anything of any consequence, and when you are done nobody has to pay, and there are no refreshments to saw off, and consequently there isn't any satisfaction whatever about it. They played dominoes till they were rested, and then they blackguarded each other privately till prayer time. When they were not seasick they were uncommonly prompt when the dinner gong sounded. Such was our daily life on board the ship: solemnity, decorum, dinner, dominoes, devotions, slander. It was not lively enough for a pleasure trip, but if we had only had a corpse it would have made a noble funeral excursion. It is all over now, but when I look back, the idea of these venerable fossils skipping forth on a 6 months' picnic seems exquisitely refreshing. The advertised title of the expedition, The Grand Holy Land Pleasure Excursion, was a misnomer. The Grand Holy Land Funeral Procession would have been better, much better. Wherever we went, in Europe, Asia, or Africa, we made a sensation, and, I suppose I may add, created a famine. None of us had ever been anywhere before. We all hailed from the interior. Travel was a wild novelty to us, and we conducted ourselves in accordance with the natural instincts that were in us, and trammeled ourselves with no ceremonies, no conventionalities. We always took care to make it understood that we were Americans. Americans! When we found that a good many foreigners had hardly ever heard of America, and that a good many more knew it only as a barbarous province away off somewhere that had lately been at war with somebody, we pitied the ignorance of the Old World, but abated no jot of our importance. Many and many a simple community in the Eastern Hemisphere will remember for years the incursion of the strange horde in the year of our Lord 1867 that called themselves Americans, and seemed to imagine in some unaccountable way that they had a right to be proud of it. We generally created a famine, partly because the coffee on the Quaker City was unendurable, and sometimes the more substantial fare was not strictly first class, and partly because one naturally tires of sitting long at the same board and eating from the same dishes. The people of those foreign countries are very, very ignorant. They looked curiously at the costumes we had brought from the wilds of America. They observed that we talked loudly at table sometimes. They noticed that we looked out for expenses, and got what we conveniently could out of a franc, and wondered where in the mischief we came from. In Paris they just simply opened their eyes and stared when we spoke to them in French. We never did succeed in making those idiots understand their own language. One of our passengers said to a shopkeeper, in reference to a proposed return to buy a pair of gloves, "Allons, restez tranquille, mais be comme munde." And would you believe it? That shopkeeper, a born Frenchman, had to ask what it was that had been said. Sometimes it seems to me, somehow, that there must be a difference between Parisian French and Quaker City French. The people stared at us everywhere, and we stared at them. We generally made them feel rather small, too, before we got done with them, because we bore down on them with America's greatness until we crushed them. And yet we took kindly to the manners and customs, and especially to the fashions of the various people we visited. When we left the Azores we wore awful capotes, and used fine-tooth combs successfully. When we came back from Tangier, in Africa, we were topped with fezzes of the bloodiest hue, hung with tassels like an Indian's scalp-lock. In France and Spain we attracted some attention in these costumes. In Italy they naturally took us for distempered Garibaldians, and set a gunboat to look for anything significant in our changes of uniform. We made Rome howl. We could have made any place howl when we had all our clothes on. We got no fresh raiment in Greece, they had but little there of any kind. But at Constantinople, how we turned out! Turbans, scimitars, fezzes, horse pistols, tunics, sashes, baggy trousers, yellow slippers. Oh, we were gorgeous. The illustrious dogs of Constantinople barked their under jaws off, and even then failed to do us justice. They are all dead by this time. They could not go through such a run of business as we gave them and survive. And then we went to see the Emperor of Russia. We just called on him as comfortably as if we had known him a century or so, and when we had finished our visit we variegated ourselves with selections from Russian costumes, and sailed away again more picturesque than ever. In Smyrna we picked up camel's hair shawls and other dressy things from Persia, but in Palestine, in Palestine, our splendid career ended. They didn't wear any clothes there to speak of. We were satisfied, and stopped. We made no experiments. We did not try their costume. But we astonished the natives of that country. We astonished them with such eccentricities of dress as we could muster. We prowled through the Holy Land from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, a weird procession of pilgrims, gotten up regardless of expense, solemn, gorgeous, green bespectacled, drowsing under blue umbrellas, and astride of a sorrier lot of horses, camels, and asses than those that came out of Noah's Ark after 11 months of seasickness and short rations. If ever those children of Israel in Palestine forget when Gideon's band went through there from America, they ought to be cursed once more and finished. It was the rarest spectacle that ever astounded mortal eyes, perhaps. Well, we were at home in Palestine. It was easy to see that that was the grand feature of the expedition. We had cared nothing much about Europe. We galloped through the Louvre, the Pitti, the Uffizi, the Vatican, all the galleries, and through the pictured and frescoed churches of Venice, Naples, and the cathedrals of Spain. Some of us said that certain of the great works of the old masters were glorious creations of genius. We found it out in the guide-book, though we got hold of the wrong picture sometimes. And the others said they were disgraceful old daubs. We examined modern and ancient statuary with a critical eye in Florence, Rome, or anywhere we found it, and praised it if we saw fit, and if we didn't, we said we preferred the wooden Indians in front of the cigar stores of America. But the Holy Land brought out all our enthusiasm. We fell into raptures by the barren shores of Galilee. We pondered at Tabor and at Nazareth. We exploded into poetry over the questionable loveliness of Esdraelon. We meditated at Jezreel and Samaria over the missionary zeal of Jehu. We rioted, fairly rioted, among the holy places of Jerusalem. We bathed in Jordan and the Dead Sea, reckless whether our accident insurance policies were extra hazardous or not, and brought away so many jugs of precious water from both places that all the country from Jericho to the mountains of Moab will suffer from drought this year, I think. Yet the pilgrimage part of the excursion was its pet feature. There is no question about that. After dismal, smileless Palestine, beautiful Egypt had few charms for us. We merely glanced at it and were ready for home. They wouldn't let us land at Malta. Quarantine. They would not let us land in Sardinia, nor at Algiers, Africa, nor at Malaga, Spain, nor Cadiz, nor at the Madeira Islands. So we got offended at all foreigners, and turned our backs upon them, and came home. I suppose we only stopped at the Bermudas because they were in the program. We did not care anything about any place at all. We wanted to go home. Homesickness was abroad in the ship. It was epidemic. If the authorities of New York had known how badly we had it, they would have quarantined us here. The grand pilgrimage is over. Goodbye to it, and a pleasant memory to it, I am able to say in all kindness. I bear no malice, no ill will toward any individual that was connected with it, either as passenger or officer. Things I did not like at all yesterday, I like very well today, now that I am at home, and always hereafter I shall be able to poke fun at the whole gang if the spirit so moves me to do, without ever saying a malicious word. The expedition accomplished all that its program promised that it should accomplish, and we ought all to be satisfied with the management of the matter, certainly. Bye-bye. Mark Twain. I call that complimentary. It is complimentary, and yet I never have received a word of thanks for it from the Hajis. On the contrary, I speak nothing but the serious truth when I say that many of them even took exceptions to the article. In endeavoring to please them,
I slaved over that sketch for 2 hours, and had my labor for my pains. I never will do a generous deed again. Conclusion. Nearly 1 year has flown since this notable pilgrimage was ended, and as I sit here at home in San Francisco, thinking, I am moved to confess that day by day the mass of my memories of the excursion have grown more and more pleasant as the disagreeable incidents of travel which encumbered them flitted one by one out of my mind. And now, if the Quaker City were weighing her anchor to sail away on the very same cruise again, nothing could gratify me more than to be a passenger, with the same captain, and even the same pilgrims, the same sinners. I was on excellent terms with 8 or 9 of the excursionists they are my staunch friends yet and was even on speaking terms with the rest of the 65. I have been at sea quite enough to know that that was a very good average, because a long sea voyage not only brings out all the mean traits one has, and exaggerates them, but raises up others which he never suspected he possessed, and even creates new ones. A 12 months' voyage at sea would make of an ordinary man a very miracle of meanness. On the other hand, if a man has good qualities, the spirit seldom moves him to exhibit them on shipboard, at least with any sort of emphasis. Now, I am satisfied that our pilgrims are pleasant old people on shore. I am also satisfied that at sea, on a second voyage, they would be pleasanter, somewhat, than they were on our grand excursion, and so I say without hesitation that I would be glad enough to sail with them again. I could at least enjoy life with my handful of old friends. They could enjoy life with their cliques as well. Passengers invariably divide up into cliques on all ships. And I will say here that I would rather travel with an excursion party of Methuselahs than have to be changing ships and comrades constantly, as people do who travel in the ordinary way. Those latter are always grieving over some other ship they have known and lost, and over other comrades whom diverging routes have separated from them. They learn to love a ship just in time to change it for another, and they become attached to a pleasant traveling companion only to lose him. They have that most dismal experience of being in a strange vessel, among strange people who care nothing about them, and of undergoing the customary bullying by strange officers and the insolence of strange servants, repeated over and over again within the compass of every month. They have also that other misery of packing and unpacking trunks, of running the distressing gauntlet of custom houses, of the anxieties attendant upon getting a mass of baggage from point to point on land in safety. I had rather sail with a whole brigade of patriarchs than suffer so. We never packed our trunks but twice, when we sailed from New York and when we returned to it. Whenever we made a land jury, we estimated how many days we should be gone and what amount of clothing we should need, figured it down to a mathematical nicety, packed a valise or two accordingly, and left the trunks on board. We chose our comrades from among our old tried friends, and started. We were never dependent upon strangers for companionship. We often had occasion to pity Americans whom we found traveling drearily among strangers, with no friends to exchange pains and pleasures with. Whenever we were coming back from a land journey, our eyes sought one thing in the distance first, the ship. And when we saw it riding at anchor with a flag apeak, we felt as a returning wanderer feels when he sees his home. When we stepped on board, our cares vanished, our troubles were at an end, for the ship was home to us. We always had the same familiar old stateroom to go to, and feel safe and at peace and comfortable again. I have no fault to find with the manner in which our excursion was conducted. Its program was faithfully carried out, a thing which surprised me, for great enterprises usually promise vastly more than they perform. It would be well if such an excursion could be gotten up every year and the system regularly inaugurated. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. The excursion is ended, and has passed to its place among the things that were. But its varied scenes and its manifold incidents will linger pleasantly in our memories for many a year to come. Always on the wing, as we were, and merely pausing a moment to catch fitful glimpses of the wonders of half a world, We could not hope to receive or retain vivid impressions of all it was our fortune to see. Yet our holiday flight has not been in vain, for, above the confusion of vague recollections, certain of its best prized pictures lift themselves and will still continue perfect in tint and outline after their surroundings shall have faded away. We shall remember something of pleasant France, and something also of Paris. Though it flashed upon us a splendid meteor and was gone again, we hardly knew how or where. We shall remember always how we saw majestic Gibraltar glorified with the rich coloring of a Spanish sunset, and swimming in a sea of rainbows. In fancy we shall see Milan again, and her stately cathedral with its marble wilderness of graceful spires, and Padua, Verona, Como, jeweled with stars, and patrician Venice afloat on her stagnant flood, silent, desolate, haughty, scornful of her humbled state, wrapping herself in memories of her lost fleets, of battles and triumph, and all the pageantry of a glory that is departed. We can not forget Florence, Naples, nor the foretaste of heaven that is the delicious atmosphere of Greece, and surely not Athens and the broken temples of the Acropolis, surely not venerable Rome, nor the green plain that compasses her round about, contrasting its brightness with her gray decay, nor the ruined arches that stand apart in the plain and clothe their looped and windowed raggedness with vines. We shall remember St. Peter's, not as one sees it when he walks the streets of Rome and fancies all her domes are just alike, but as he sees it leagues away, when every meaner edifice has faded out of sight, and that one dome looms superbly up in the flush of sunset, full of dignity and grace, strongly outlined as a mountain. We shall remember Constantinople and the Bosporus, the colossal magnificence of Baalbek, the pyramids of Egypt, the prodigious form, the benignant countenance of the Sphinx, Oriental Smyrna, sacred Jerusalem, Damascus, the pearl of the East, the pride of Syria, the fabled Garden of Eden, the home of princes and genii of the Arabian Nights, the oldest metropolis on earth, the one city in all the world that has kept its name and held its place and looked serenely on while the kingdoms and empires of 4,000 years have risen to life, enjoyed their little season of pride and pomp, and then vanished and been forgotten. End of The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain.